In the autumn of 1976, 12 high school students boarded a charter bus for what should have been a routine field trip to the Appalachian caves. Only the driver returned, his mind shattered, muttering about darkness that moved and children who walked backward into stone. For 47 years, their families have lived with silence. But when a graduate student discovers something impossible buried in university archives, a photograph dated 3 weeks after the disappearance, showing all 12 students standing in front of a building that doesn't exist. The question is no longer what happened to them. It's whether they ever really left at all. If you're drawn to mysteries that refuse to let go, stories that blur the line between investigation and obsession, make sure to subscribe and follow this journey into one of America's most disturbing unsolved cases. The photograph arrived at Whitmore University's Department of History on a Tuesday morning in September 2023, tucked inside a manila envelope with no return address. Graduate assistant Sophie Chen almost threw it away with the usual donation clutter. Old yearbooks, faded newsletters, someone's grandfather's war medals. But something about the weight of the envelope made her pause. Inside was a single black and white photograph, corners bent with age, the image slightly out of focus, as if taken in haste. 12 teenagers stood in 2 neat rows, 6 in front, 6 behind, all wearing the same expression of vacant contentment. The girls in dated dresses with high collars, the boys in slacks and button-up shirts. Behind them loomed a large institutional building with tall windows and a peculiar architectural style. Gothic revival mixed with something else, something Sophie couldn't quite place. She turned the photo over, written in faded blue ink. October 29th, 1976. All are well. Sophie's breath caught. October 29th, 1976. She knew that date. Every student at Whitmore knew that date, at least those who bothered to learn the campus legends. That was 3 weeks after the Millbrook 12 vanished. She held the photograph closer to her desk lamp, studying each face. Even in the grainy image, she could see details. A girl's hand resting on another's shoulder, a boy's crooked smile, the way they stood with an eerie uniformity of posture. And their eyes. Something about their eyes. Sophie pulled out her phone and searched for the original missing persons reports, the ones that had been digitized and uploaded to the university's historical database. The 12 faces from 1976 appeared on her screen. School photos, candid shots from yearbooks, pictures provided by desperate parents. She compared them to the photograph in her hand, moving between faces, checking and rechecking. It was them, all 12 of them. Her hands trembled as she set the photograph on her desk. Protocol dictated she should log it, file it, report it to her supervisor. But Sophie had written her undergraduate thesis on the Millbrook 12. She had spent 3 years interviewing the few surviving family members, reading through police reports, trying to piece together what had happened on that October day in 1976. She had stood at the cave entrance where the bus had been found, the driver still inside, rocking and weeping. She had walked the trails they were supposed to have hiked, looking for something, anything, that might explain. And now, this. Evidence that they had been alive, together, 21 days after they supposedly disappeared. Evidence that no one had ever seen before. Sophie picked up the photograph again, holding it by the edges. The building behind the students nagged at her. She had researched every structure in the region, every possible location they might have gone. This building didn't match anything in her files. As she stared at the image, something else caught her attention. In the bottom right corner, barely visible, was the shadow of someone standing just out of frame. A figure with an elongated shape as if the person had been standing at an angle when the photo was taken, or as if they were taller than should have been possible. And there was something in their hand, something that looked almost like— Sophie's office phone rang, making her jump. She answered with a shaky voice, still staring at the photograph. "Sophie Chen," she said. "Miss Chen, this is Detective Raymond Moss, Pennsylvania State Police, Cold Case Division. I understand you're the university's primary researcher on the 1976 Millbrook disappearances." Sophie's mouth went dry. Yes, I am. How did you— We need to talk about something that's come up. Something we found yesterday during a routine excavation at the old Harlow Psychiatric Hospital site. He paused. "You might want to sit down for this." Sophie was already sitting, but she gripped the edge of her desk anyway. "What did you find?" 12 sets of clothes," Detective Moss said quietly. "Buried in a specific pattern, arranged in a circle around what appears to be some kind of altar or ceremonial space. The clothes match the descriptions from the missing persons reports. Dated fibers, period-appropriate fabrics, even the right sizes." Another pause. "Miss Chen, we also found something else. Dental records. They match 11 of the 12 students." 11? Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. "The 12th set of remains isn't there. We're not sure what that means yet." Sophie looked down at the photograph on her desk, at the 12 faces staring back at her with those strange, empty eyes. Her voice came out mechanical, distant. "Detective Moss, I think you should come to the university. There's something you need to see." After she hung up, Sophie sat in the growing darkness of her office, the only light coming from her desk lamp. She didn't turn on the overhead lights. Somehow, the shadows felt safer. The photograph lay between her hands, and as the evening deepened, Sophie could have sworn the faces in the image had shifted slightly, their smiles a fraction wider, their eyes a degree more alert. Watching? Waiting? She thought about the envelope with no return address. She thought about the timing. Why now, after 47 years? And she thought about that shadow in the corner of the photograph, the figure just out of frame, holding something that looked disturbingly like a conductor's baton. Outside her window, the campus bells began to toll the hour. 7 chimes, each one echoing across the quadrangle, where students hurried between buildings, laughing and talking, utterly unaware that beneath their feet, in the archives and buried places, the past was clawing its way back to the surface. Sophie pulled out a fresh notebook and wrote at the top of the first page, "What really happened to the Millbrook 12? Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added a second question underneath. "What came back?" The detective arrived the following morning, while Sophie was still cataloging the photograph's every detail. She had spent the entire night in her office, unable to sleep, unable to look away from those 12 faces. When Detective Raymond Moss walked through her door, she understood immediately why cold cases were his specialty. He had the weathered look of someone who had spent decades staring at unsolvable puzzles, his gray eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, his suit practical rather than stylish. "Miss Chen," he said, offering his hand. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice." Sophie shook his hand and gestured to the chair across from her desk. The photograph lay between them, protected now by a clear archival sleeve, though Sophie wasn't sure why she bothered preserving something that might be evidence of something far darker than a simple missing persons case. Moss picked up the sleeve carefully, holding it up to the morning light streaming through the window. His expression remained neutral, but Sophie saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It arrived yesterday morning. Anonymous delivery. No return address." Sophie pulled out the manila envelope, now sealed in its own protective sleeve. The postmark is local, dated 4 days ago. Moss set down the photograph and examined the envelope. Someone in the area wanted you to have this, someone who's been holding on to it for 47 years. He looked up at her. Why you specifically? I wrote my thesis on the disappearance, published several papers. I've been the most vocal researcher on the case for the past few years. Sophie leaned forward. But I want to know about what you found at Harlow. The clothes, the remains. You said 11 sets. The detective pulled out a tablet from his briefcase and brought up several crime scene photographs. Sophie's stomach turned as she looked at the images. A circular pit in the earth, clothes arranged in a perfect ring, each outfit laid out as if an invisible body still wore them. And in the center, a raised stone platform with markings carved into its surface. We found this 2 days ago during preliminary excavation for a new housing development, Moss explained. The Harlow Psychiatric Hospital was demolished in 1989. But this was underneath the old administration building, in what we think was a basement level that wasn't on any official blueprints. Sophie studied the symbols on the stone platform. They looked almost like medical notation, but distorted wrong. Have you had anyone analyze these markings? We're working on it. But here's what's keeping me awake at night. Moss swiped to another image, this one showing what appeared to be a logbook, its pages yellowed and brittle. We found this buried with the clothes. It's a patient intake log from Harlow, dating from September through November 1976. He handed the tablet to Sophie, and she read the entries with growing horror. 12 names admitted on October 8, 1976, the same day the students had disappeared. But these weren't the names of the missing students. These were different names entirely, each one preceded by the title subject, and followed by a series of numbers and medical codes. I don't understand, Sophie said. Are you saying the students were taken to Harlow? That's one theory. But look at the discharge dates. Sophie scrolled down the page. All 12 subjects had been discharged on October 29, 1976, the same date written on the back of the photograph. Her hands went cold. This doesn't make sense. Harlow was a psychiatric hospital. Why would 12 missing high school students be admitted there under false names? And why would there be no record of this? No investigation? Because officially this logbook doesn't exist, Moss said quietly. It wasn't in any hospital archive, any state record. It was buried in an unmarked pit with clothes that belonged to dead children. He took back the tablet. Miss Chen, I need you to understand something. What we found at that site isn't just evidence of where these kids ended up. It's evidence of something organized, something deliberate. The way those clothes were arranged, the altar, those symbols. Someone was conducting experiments, or rituals, or God knows what with those children. Sophie looked again at the photograph on her desk. And then someone took their picture 3 weeks later and wanted the world to know they were still alive. Or wanted us to think they were alive. Moss stood and walked to the window, looking out at the campus quad, where students moved between classes. I've worked cold cases for 23 years. I've seen a lot of terrible things. But this case has layers I can't make sense of. We have physical evidence that 11 of these kids died and were buried at Harlow. We have documentary evidence that 12 patients matching their description were held there. And we have photographic evidence that all 12 of them were alive and well, 3 weeks after they supposedly disappeared. He turned back to Sophie. I need your help. You know this case better than anyone. You've interviewed the families, studied the geography, analyzed the timeline. I need you to help me understand what we're really looking at here. Sophie picked up the photograph again, studying it more carefully now. The building behind the students. She pulled out her laptop and began searching through historical architectural databases, cross-referencing with the period and region. Moss watched over her shoulder as she worked, both of them silent, except for the clicking of keys. After 20 minutes, Sophie stopped. I think I found it. On her screen was an architectural drawing from 1952, a proposed expansion of the Harlow Psychiatric Hospital that was never completed. The building matched the one in the photograph almost exactly. The same Gothic windows, the same unusual roofline, the same peculiar proportions. The Harlow West Wing, Sophie read from the description. Designed for long-term patient care and experimental treatment protocols. Construction began in 1953, but was halted in 1954 due to budget constraints and concerns raised by the State Medical Board. She looked up at Moss. This building was never supposed to exist. They tore down what had been built. Except someone finished it, Moss said. Someone completed that building off the books and used it for whatever they were doing with those kids. Sophie's mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. The bus driver, she said suddenly. Calvin Reeves. He's still alive, still in the psychiatric facility where they placed him after the incident. I tried to interview him for my thesis, but he wasn't coherent. Just kept repeating the same phrases about darkness and walking backward. Moss nodded slowly. I know. I read your thesis. But maybe it's time we tried talking to him again. Sometimes time and the right questions can unlock things that seemed impossible before. They spent the next hour going through Sophie's research files, laying out everything known about the disappearance. The field trip had been organized by the biology department at Millbrook High School, a reward for the school's top students. 12 kids, ages 16 to 18, all high achievers, all from good families. The trip was supervised by the bus driver, Calvin Reeves, and was supposed to include a park ranger. But the ranger had called in sick that morning. The bus had departed Millbrook at 7 in the morning on October 8, 1976. It was supposed to arrive at Cooper's Cave State Park by 9. At 3 in the afternoon, a hiker found the bus parked at the cave entrance, engines still running, driver's door open. Calvin Reeves was inside, curled in the aisle between the seats, unresponsive. The 12 students were gone. Search parties had combed the caves for weeks. They found nothing. No clothing, no personal items, no signs of struggle. It was as if the students had simply walked off the bus and vanished into the mountain. What if they didn't vanish into the mountain? Sophie said, thinking aloud. What if someone was waiting for them? What if the sick park ranger wasn't coincidence? Moss pulled out a notepad and began writing. We need to find out who that ranger was supposed to be. And we need to track down anyone who worked at Harlow in 1976, particularly anyone involved in patient intake or experimental programs. Most of them would be dead by now, Sophie pointed out. Harlow closed 34 years ago. Most, but not all. And the ones who are left might be ready to talk. People get guilty in their old age. They want to confess before they die. Moss checked his watch. I have a team meeting in 2 hours. Can you come with me? I'd like you to brief my investigators on what you know. Sophie looked around her small office. The stacks of research papers, the filing cabinets full of interview transcripts, the wall where she had pinned a timeline of the disappearance. She had spent years chasing this mystery in an academic way, keeping it at a safe distance, treating it like a historical puzzle rather than a real tragedy that had destroyed 12 families. But the photograph changed everything. The photograph and the buried clothes and the impossible logbook made it real in a way that research never had. "Yes," she said, "I'll come. But first, I need to make some calls. If we're reopening this investigation, the families deserve to know." Moss nodded gravely. "Agreed. But be careful what you tell them. We don't want to raise hopes we can't deliver on. And we don't want to traumatize people who've spent 47 years trying to move on." After he left, Sophie sat alone with the photograph. She thought about 12 families who had watched their children leave for school one October morning and never saw them again. 12 sets of parents who had aged through decades of not knowing, of imagining every possible horror, of jumping every time the phone rang or a stranger knocked on the door. And somewhere, someone knew what had happened. Someone had taken this photograph. Someone had buried those clothes in that ritual circle. Someone had kept these secrets for nearly half a century and had now decided, for whatever reason, to let the truth begin seeping out. Sophie pulled out her phone and began making calls. The first number she dialed belonged to Patricia Oakes, whose daughter Jennifer had been on that bus. Patricia was 78 now, living in a nursing home in Philadelphia. The phone rang 4 times before a weak voice answered. "Hello?" "Mrs. Oakes, this is Sophie Chen from Whitmore University. We spoke 3 years ago about Jennifer." There was a long pause. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had changed, become younger somehow, desperate with hope and fear. "Have you found something? Please, tell me you found something." Sophie looked at the photograph, at Jennifer Oakes's face in the front row, her expression vacant and serene. "Yes," Sophie said quietly. "I think we have." The Pennsylvania State Police Cold Case Division operated out of a nondescript building on the outskirts of Harrisburg, far enough from the capital that politicians couldn't drop by unannounced, but close enough that the department could claim proximity to power. Sophie arrived just after noon, having spent the morning on phone calls that left her emotionally drained. 3 of the families she contacted had moved on as best they could. The parents dead, the siblings scattered across the country, unwilling to reopen old wounds. But 4 families were still waiting, still desperate for answers, and the hope in their voices when Sophie mentioned new evidence had nearly broken her. Detective Moss met her in the lobby and guided her through security, then up 2 flights of stairs to a conference room where 6 other investigators waited. They looked up as Sophie entered, their expressions ranging from skeptical to curious. A large whiteboard covered one wall, already filled with photographs and tone-line notations. "Everyone, this is Sophie Chen, the graduate researcher I mentioned," Moss said. "She's our primary expert on the historical aspects of the case. Sophie, this is my team." He went around the room making introductions. Detective Linda Fromm, Documents and Records. Detective Marcus Webb, Forensic Analysis. Detective Sarah Coe, Victimology. 2 junior investigators whose names Sophie immediately forgot in her nervousness. And at the head of the table, Lieutenant Gregory Marsh, a heavy-set man in his 60s, with the exhausted look of someone who had seen too many cases end in failure. "Miss Chen," Marsh said, his voice gravelly from what Sophie guessed were decades of cigarettes. "Ray tells me you've been chasing this case for years. Tell us what you know that we don't." Sophie took a breath and launched into what she had prepared during the drive, a comprehensive overview of the disappearance, the investigation, the dead ends. As she talked, Detective Fromm pulled up a digital presentation on the screen behind her, images that Sophie had provided earlier. School photos of the 12 students appeared one by one, as she named them. Jennifer Oakes, 16, straight-A student, wanted to be a doctor. Thomas Brennan, 18, basketball captain, already accepted to Penn State. Melissa Grayson, 17, artist, won a statewide competition for her charcoal portraits. David Chen, no relation to Sophie, she always had to clarify. 16, math prodigy, already taking calculus at the local college. The list continued. 12 bright, promising lives, snuffed out or stolen, or transformed into whatever those vacant-eyed figures in the photograph had become. When Sophie finished, she pulled out the photograph and passed it to Lieutenant Marsh. This arrived at my office yesterday. Note the date on the back. Marsh studied it carefully, then passed it to Detective Coe, who examined it with a magnifying glass. The photographic paper is consistent with mid-1970s stock, Coe said. The chemical composition, the grain structure, this isn't a modern reproduction, and the clothing matches the period exactly. So, we're looking at a genuine photograph from 1976, Marsh said, which means someone had these kids alive and together 3 weeks after they supposedly vanished from that cave. He looked at Moss. Ray, walk us through what you found at Harlow. Moss brought up the crime scene photos on the screen, and Sophie heard several sharp intakes of breath around the table as the circular arrangement of clothes appeared. He explained about the hidden basement, the unmarked logbook, the dental records. 11 sets of remains, Detective Webb said, leaning forward. You're certain about that? As certain as we can be without full DNA analysis, which is ongoing, Moss replied. But the dental records are solid. We matched them against records from the students' family dentists. 11 positive IDs. Which one is missing? Detective Fram asked. Moss clicked to a new slide, showing the list of names. Carolyn Vestry, 17, the youngest of the group. We found clothes that match what she was wearing according to witness statements, but no remains. Sophie felt a chill run through her. Carolyn Vestry. She pulled out her own notes, flipping through pages until she found what she was looking for. Carolyn was the only student on that trip who had a chronic medical condition, type 1 diabetes. She needed insulin injections twice daily. So either she died elsewhere and her body was disposed of differently, Detective Coe suggested, or she survived whatever happened to the others. Or she was the one taking the photograph, Sophie said quietly. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at her. Look at the photo again, Sophie continued. 12 students in the frame, but someone had to be behind the camera. What if it was Carolyn? What if she was the one who documented this, who kept this photograph for 47 years, and who finally decided to send it to someone who might understand? Lieutenant Marsh tapped his fingers on the table, thinking. That would make her either a victim who escaped, or someone complicit in what happened. He looked at Moss. Do we have any leads on Carolyn Vestry's whereabouts? We're working on it. But she effectively vanished along with the others. No Social Security activity, no tax records, no death certificate. If she survived, she's been living under a different identity. Detective Fromm pulled up a new document on the screen. I've been going through employment records from Harlow Psychiatric Hospital in 1976. The place was a mess administratively. They went through 3 directors in 2 years, lots of staff turnover, financial irregularities that caught state attention. But one name keeps appearing in unusual contexts. The screen showed a personnel file. Dr. Malcolm Thorne, Director of Experimental Therapeutics. His staff photo revealed a thin man in his 40s with intense eyes and a slight smile that didn't reach past his lips. Thorne came to Harlow in 1974, Fromm continued. Before that, he worked at several other institutions, always in research capacities. His specialty was behavioral modification and what he called consciousness restructuring. He published several papers in fringe psychology journals about breaking down personality and rebuilding it from base components. Jesus, Detective Coe muttered. MK Ultra stuff. Fromm nodded. That's what I thought too. The CIA's mind control experiments were winding down in the mid-70s, but people like Thorne were still pursuing similar research independently. And here's the interesting part. Thorne disappeared in November 1976, just stopped showing up to work. His apartment was cleaned out. No forwarding address. No contact with colleagues. Right after those 12 subjects were discharged from the hospital, Sophie said, seeing the connection. Exactly. And look at this. Fromm clicked to another page. Thorne requisitioned a significant amount of medical supplies in September and October 1976. Sedatives, restraints, monitoring equipment, more than what a small research program would typically need. Lieutenant Marsh stood and walked to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. Let's map this out. October 8th, students disappear from the cave. Same day, 12 unidentified subjects are admitted to Harlow under Thorne's care. 3 weeks later, October 29th, subjects are discharged and Thorne vanishes. Shortly after, those 12 students or their remains end up in a ritual burial beneath the hospital. But the photograph shows them alive on October 29th, Detective Coe pointed out, standing in front of a building that shouldn't exist. Which means the burial happened later, Moss said. Maybe weeks or months later. The question is, what was Thorne doing with them during that time? And what went wrong that led to 11 of them dying? Sophie thought about the vacant expressions in the photograph, the way all 12 students stood, with identical posture, their hands positioned the same way. What if nothing went wrong? What if this was the intended outcome? Everyone looked at her. Think about it, Sophie continued, her voice gaining strength as the pieces fell into place in her mind. Thorne was researching personality restructuring, breaking down and rebuilding consciousness. What if these students were part of an experiment? What if he was trying to create something, shape them into something else? To what end? Lieutenant Marsh asked. I don't know. But look at the ritual burial site. Those symbols on the altar, the circular arrangement. That's not just disposal of bodies. That's ceremonial. Like they were being offered or transformed or preserved. Detective Webb had been quiet until now, but he leaned forward, his expression troubled. I had the symbols photographed and sent to a consultant at the university, someone who specializes in esoteric religious iconography. She got back to me this morning. He pulled out a folder and distributed copies of the consultant's report. According to Dr. Hadley, these markings combine elements of several different mystical traditions, Hermetic alchemy, Gnostic Christianity, even some pre-Columbian shamanic symbols. But they're arranged in a way she's never seen before, like someone was creating a new system of belief or practice. Sophie read through the report, her unease growing. The consultant had noted that the central symbol on the altar appeared to represent a doorway or threshold, with the surrounding marks indicating passage from one state of being to another. Dr. Hadley also noted something disturbing, Webb continued. The arrangement of the clothes around the altar mirrors a practice used in certain death cults, the idea being that the physical body is shed like a garment, while the consciousness or soul moves to a different plane or vessel. You're saying Thorne believed he could transfer their minds somewhere else? Detective Frame sounded skeptical. I'm saying Thorne might have believed that, yes. Whether it was actually possible is another question entirely. Lieutenant Marsh rubbed his temples. This is getting into territory that makes me uncomfortable. We're police investigators, not paranormal researchers. Let's focus on what we can prove and prosecute. Except Thorne has been missing for 47 years, Moss pointed out. If he's even still alive, he'd be in his 90s now. Then we find his associates, his colleagues, anyone who worked with him at Harlow. Marsh turned to Fromm. I want a complete list of everyone on staff during Thorne's tenure. Track them down, interview them all. Someone knew what he was doing. The meeting continued for another hour. Assignments distributed, timelines established. Sophie found herself designated as historical consultant, responsible for maintaining the research database and identifying potential witnesses or evidence from the period. When they finally broke, she felt exhausted, overwhelmed by the scope of what they were attempting. Detective Moss caught up with her in the parking lot as she was heading to her car. You did well in there, he said. I know Marsh can be intense, but he's good at his job. If anyone can solve this, he can. Do you really think we'll find answers? Sophie asked. Or are we just going to uncover more questions? Moss was quiet for a moment, looking back at the building where his team was already diving into research. In my experience, the truth in cases like this is usually worse than anyone imagines. But the families deserve to know, even if it breaks their hearts all over again. He pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. That's my personal cell. If you find anything at all, call me immediately. And Sophie, be careful. Someone sent you that photograph for a reason. They wanted this investigation reopened. We don't know if that's because they want justice or because they want something else entirely. Sophie took the card, a shiver running through her despite the warm afternoon sun. You think whoever sent it might still be dangerous. I think we're dealing with someone who participated in or witnessed the disappearance of 12 children and kept silent for 47 years, someone who has lived with those secrets festering inside them for nearly half a century. That kind of psychological weight either destroys a person or transforms them into something we can't predict. He walked back toward the building, leaving Sophie alone in the parking lot. She got into her car, but didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, she pulled out her phone and looked at the digital copy of the photograph she had made, zooming in on the faces, studying each one. 12 students who had left for a field trip and never came home. 11 of whom were now confirmed dead, buried in a ritual circle beneath a psychiatric hospital. One of whom might still be out there, alive, holding the key to everything that had happened. Sophie thought about Carolyn Vestry, the diabetic girl who needed insulin to survive. If she had escaped or been spared, she would have needed access to medical care, to supplies. There would be a trail, however faint. She opened her laptop and began searching through medical supply companies, pharmacies, anything that might have records going back to 1976. It was a long shot, but Sophie had built her academic career on long shots and patient research. As the afternoon faded into evening, sitting in her car in a parking lot in Harrisburg, Sophie lost herself in the search. And slowly, very slowly, a pattern began to emerge in the data. Small purchases of insulin and diabetic supplies, always paid for in cash, always in different locations, but following a geographic progression that moved steadily west over the course of several years. Someone had been moving, staying ahead of something or someone, but leaving just enough of a trail that a determined researcher might be able to follow. Sophie plotted the locations on a map and felt her breath catch. The trail ended in a small town in western Pennsylvania, not far from the Ohio border. A place called Ashford, population 3,000, notable for nothing, except that it still had one of the few remaining state psychiatric facilities in operation. She pulled out Detective Moss's card and dialed his number. He answered on the second ring. Moss here. It's Sophie Chen. I think I found her. I think I found Carolyn Vestry. The drive to Ashford took 3 hours, winding through increasingly rural Pennsylvania landscape until the highways gave way to county roads, and finally to the kind of small-town streets where everyone knew everyone else's business. Sophie had wanted to leave immediately after calling Detective Moss, but he had insisted they wait until morning, that they approach this carefully and with proper backup. So they met at a rest stop outside Harrisburg at 6 in the morning. Moss in an unmarked police car, with Detective Coe riding along as secondary investigator. Sophie followed in her own vehicle, the autumn morning cold enough that her breath fogged the windshield. They had decided that Sophie should make the initial approach if they found Carolyn Vestry. A graduate student researching a historical case would seem less threatening than two detectives, and if Carolyn had been running for 47 years, the last thing they wanted was to spook her into disappearing again. Ashford appeared gradually through morning mist, a collection of old brick buildings clustered around a central square, the kind of town that had probably thrived in the early 20th century, when manufacturing still sustained these rural communities. Now, it had the shabby, faded look of a place slowly losing population, with more closed storefronts than open ones, and residents who eyed strangers with automatic suspicion. The state psychiatric facility sat on the northern edge of town, a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by a high fence. But they weren't going there first. Sophie's research had indicated that whoever was purchasing diabetic supplies had been using a small pharmacy on Main Street, a family-owned place called Hartley's that had been in operation since 1952. They parked a block away and walked to the pharmacy, Sophie in the lead with Moss and Coe hanging back, trying to look like casual shoppers. A bell chimed as Sophie entered, and an elderly man behind the counter looked up from a crossword puzzle. "Help you?" he asked, his voice carrying the distinctive flat vowels of Western Pennsylvania. "I hope so," Sophie said, putting on her best graduate student smile. "I'm researching a historical case for my dissertation, and I'm trying to track down someone who might have lived in this area. Her name is Carolyn Vestry, or at least it was in 1976. The man's expression didn't change, but Sophie saw his hand tighten slightly on his pen. "That's a long time ago. Don't recall anyone by that name." "She would have had type 1 diabetes," Sophie continued, "would have needed regular insulin prescriptions, probably preferred to pay in cash rather than use insurance." Now the man set down his pen entirely. "Why are you looking for this person?" Sophie had prepared for this question, had practiced her answer during the drive. She was a witness to something important, not a suspect, not in trouble. But there are families who need answers about what happened to people they loved, and I think Carolyn might be able to help them. The man studied her for a long moment. "You police?" "No. I'm just a researcher. But I am working with law enforcement." She pulled out her university ID, showing him. "I promise. I'm only trying to find the truth." Another pause. Longer this time? Then the man sighed and closed his crossword puzzle. "I'm Paul Hartley. This is my pharmacy. Was my father's before me. And, yeah, I know who you're talking about. But the name isn't Vestry. It's Marsh. Carolyn Marsh." Sophie felt her pulse quicken. "She lives here? In Ashford?" "Worked at the state facility for near about 30 years before she retired. Keeps to herself mostly. Lives in a small house on Elm Street. The blue one with the white shutters." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Whatever happened to that woman? It broke something inside her. She comes in here once a month for her medication, and in all these years, I've never heard her speak more than absolutely necessary. It's like she's afraid words themselves might give her away. Does she know people are looking for her? If she does, She's never said, but there's a sadness to her, a kind of waiting quality, like she's expecting someone to knock on her door eventually. Hartley picked up his pen again, but didn't return to his puzzle. You seem like a decent person. So, I'll tell you this. Be gentle with her. Whatever she's carrying, it's heavy enough to have bent her entire life around it. Sophie thanked him and left the pharmacy, rejoining Moss and Co. outside. She relayed what Hartley had told her, and they walked together to Elm Street, finding the blue house with white shutters easily. It was a modest single-story structure with a well-maintained yard, lace curtains in the windows, a mailbox that read C. Marsh in faded letters. How do you want to play this? Moss asked quietly. Let me go alone first. If she sees police, she might panic. Sophie took a breath, steadying her nerves. Give me 15 minutes. If I'm not out, or if there's any problem, come in. She walked up the concrete path to the front door and knocked. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time, and heard movement inside. Footsteps, slow and cautious. The door opened a crack, and a face peered out, pale and pinched with age, but unmistakably the same face from the school photos Sophie had studied for years. Carolyn Vestry, Sophie said gently. The woman flinched at the name, her hand gripping the doorframe. No one's called me that in a very long time. My name is Sophie Chen. I'm a researcher from Whitmore University, and I've been studying what happened in October 1976. I need to talk to you about the field trip, about Harlow, about Dr. Thorne. For a moment, Sophie thought Carolyn would slam the door. The woman's face went through a series of emotions: fear, anger, resignation, and finally something that looked almost like relief. I wondered when someone would finally come, Carolyn said quietly. She opened the door wider. You might as well come in. The interior of the house was neat but sparse, the furniture old but well kept, the walls bare, except for a single photograph of mountains. Carolyn led Sophie to a small kitchen table and gestured for her to sit. She moved slowly, stiffly, as if her body carried more years than her actual age of 64. How did you find me? Carolyn asked, putting a kettle on the stove. Medical records, diabetic supply purchases. You left a trail, probably without meaning to. I tried to be careful, but I suppose after 47 years, I got complacent. She sat down across from Sophie, her hands folded on the table. They were liver-spotted and scarred, the hands of someone who had worked hard her entire life. You said you're working with law enforcement? The Pennsylvania State Police Cold Case Division. They found remains at Harlow, beneath where the old administration building stood. 11 sets of remains. Carolyn closed her eyes. Which one didn't they find? They found your clothes, but no body. Of course not, I'm not dead. She opened her eyes, and Sophie saw something ancient and broken in them. Though there were times I wished I was. The kettle began to whistle, but Carolyn made no move to get it. She just sat there, staring at Sophie with an expression that combined hope and horror. Tell me what happened, Sophie said softly. Tell me everything. Carolyn was silent for so long that Sophie wondered if she would answer at all. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. The bus trip was real, at least at the start. We were all so excited, 12 of us, the best students in the school, getting to explore the caves. But when we got there, the bus didn't go to the park entrance. The driver, Mr. Reeves, he took us to a different location, a service road that led to the old Harlow facility. Sophie felt cold, despite the warmth of the kitchen. Reeves was in on it? He was paid, I think. Or threatened. I never knew which. When we realized we weren't at the park, some of the kids started to panic, But these men came out of the building, and they had guns. They herded us inside like cattle. Carolyn's voice remained flat, emotionless, as if she was reciting facts from a textbook, rather than reliving her own trauma. They separated us immediately, put us in different rooms, all white walls and locked doors. I remember Jennifer Oakes screaming, and then the screaming stopped, and I never heard her voice again. What did they do to you? Carolyn stood and retrieved the kettle, pouring water into 2 cups with tea bags. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice remained steady. Dr. Thorne called it cognitive restructuring. He said we were going to be part of something important, something that would change our understanding of human consciousness. For the first week, they just kept us isolated, no food, minimal water. They'd come in at random intervals and play sounds, recordings of our parents' voices, distorted and overlapping, until we couldn't tell what was real anymore. She set a cup in front of Sophie, who wrapped her hands around it, but didn't drink. Then the drugs started. Injections that made the world swim and twist. They'd show us images, violent, horrible things, and ask us questions about them over and over. What do you see? What do you feel? Who are you? They wanted us to forget ourselves, to become blank slates they could write on. But it didn't work on you, Sophie said. Carolyn laughed bitterly. Oh, it worked for a while. I forgot my name, forgot my family. I thought I was someone called Subject 7. I thought Dr. Thorne was my father, and that my entire previous life had been a dream. She sipped her tea, her eyes distant. But the diabetes saved me in a strange way. I needed insulin regularly, or I'd go into shock. They couldn't deprive me of medical care the way they could the others, because I'd die too quickly. And Thorne wanted us alive for whatever he was planning. The photograph, Sophie said. The one dated October 29th. That was real? Very real. That was the day Thorne declared the process complete. He lined us all up in front of the West Wing, the building he'd constructed in secret, and took that picture. We were supposed to be proof of his success, his 12 perfect blank subjects, ready to be reprogrammed with whatever personalities or purposes he desired. Sophie pulled out her phone and showed Carolyn the photograph. Who took this picture? Carolyn stared at the image, her face contorting with pain. I did. Thorne handed me the camera and told me to document his achievement. I remember standing there, looking through the viewfinder at my friends, at what used to be my friends, and feeling absolutely nothing. No recognition, no horror, just emptiness. What changed? How did you escape? The insulin, Carolyn said again. About a week after that photograph, my supply ran low. Thorne had been administering it himself, controlling the doses, using it as another way to manipulate me. But he miscalculated. He gave me too little one day, and I went into diabetic ketoacidosis. I should have died, but instead something happened. The metabolic shock broke through whatever barriers the drugs and conditioning had created. I started remembering. Not everything at first, just flashes. My mother's face, my bedroom, the bus ride. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at her quiet street. I pretended I was still under his control while I tried to figure out what to do. But I was too late to save the others. One night, I heard Thorne talking to his assistants. He said the subjects were ready for the final stage, something he called the separation. They were going to kill our bodies and try to preserve our consciousness somehow, using some kind of ritual he'd developed based on a combination of psychology and occult practices. The altar in the basement, Sophie said. I didn't see it, but I heard them preparing. They were going to do it to all 12 of us, in one ceremony. But the night before it was supposed to happen, I managed to get out. Thorne had left my insulin kit on a table during one of his lectures to his staff about consciousness transfer, and I grabbed it and ran. Just ran into the woods around Harlow and kept running until I couldn't anymore. You didn't go to the police? Carolyn turned to face her, and the look in her eyes was pure anguish. I tried. I made it to a gas station about 20 miles away and tried to tell them. But I was incoherent, sick from the insulin irregularity, and I couldn't prove who I was. They thought I was just another escaped psychiatric patient. They called Harlow, and Thorne himself came to get me with official-looking paperwork, saying I was a schizophrenic patient having a delusional episode. He took you back. He took me to his car, but we never made it back to Harlow. I remember him pulling over on a dark road, and I thought he was going to kill me right there. Instead, he just looked at me for a long time, and then he said something I've never forgotten. "You're proof that the human will is more resilient than I calculated. I should be disappointed, but instead, I'm fascinated. Go, run. But if you ever tell anyone what happened here, I'll finish what I started with the others, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you could have saved them." Sophie felt sick. He let you go, to keep you silent. He didn't just let me go. He gave me money, false documents, everything I needed to start a new life. And then he went back and completed his ritual with the other 11. I've had to live with that knowledge for 47 years, that I escaped while my friends died, that I was free while they were being murdered in some insane ceremony. Carolyn, that wasn't your fault. You were a victim too. Was I? Carolyn's voice rose for the first time, sharp with decades of self-recrimination. I took that photograph. I watched them turn into empty shells, and I did nothing. And when I had the chance to expose Thorne, I ran instead. I've been running my whole life. Sophie stood and moved closer to Carolyn, who was now openly weeping. You were 17 years old. You were drugged, manipulated, traumatized, and you survived. That took incredible strength. Then why did I send you that photograph? Carolyn asked through her tears. Why now? After all these years? Sophie went still. You sent it? I've kept it all this time, hidden away like a terrible relic. But last month, I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors give me maybe 6 months. She wiped her eyes roughly. I couldn't die with this secret. I couldn't let those families spend the rest of their lives wondering. So I sent the photograph to you because I'd read your research, your thesis. I thought if anyone would understand, if anyone would care enough to investigate properly, it would be you. Carolyn, this isn't just about the photograph anymore. The police found the burial site. They found remains. We can prove what happened now. Can you? Carolyn turned to face her fully. You can prove 11 children died at Harlow. But can you prove why? Can you prove what Thorne was really trying to do? Can you explain to those families that their children were killed as part of some mad experiment in consciousness transfer? Sophie didn't have an answer to that. A knock on the door made them both jump. Sophie went to answer it and found Detective Moss standing on the porch, his expression concerned. Everything all right? He asked quietly. You've been in there almost 40 minutes. Sophie stepped outside and updated him quickly, her voice low. When she finished, Moss looked past her into the house, where Carolyn stood in the kitchen doorway watching them. Ms. Vestry, Moss called. I'm Detective Raymond Moss, with the Pennsylvania State Police. I'd like to talk to you about filing formal charges against Dr. Malcolm Thorne for kidnapping, false imprisonment, and 11 counts of murder. Carolyn laughed, a sound without humor. You'll have a hard time prosecuting a dead man, Detective. Moss went very still. Dr. Thorne is dead. Has been for 46 years. He died in November 1976, about 2 weeks after he let me go. I read about it in a newspaper. Single car accident. Drove off a cliff outside Pittsburgh. Authorities ruled it suicide. She paused. I've never been sure if it was suicide or if someone else involved in what happened decided he knew too much. The three of them stood in silence. The morning sun, now fully illuminating the quiet street. Sophie felt the weight of this revelation settle over the investigation like a shroud. Their primary suspect, the architect of whatever horror had occurred at Harlow, was beyond justice. There were others, Sophie said suddenly. Thorne couldn't have done this alone. The staff, the people who helped him, who knew what he was doing. Most of them are probably dead too, Carolyn said. And the ones who aren't. I never knew their names. Thorne kept everyone compartmentalized. I only ever saw faces, heard voices. Then we need your testimony, Moss said. Everything you remember, everything you witnessed. It may not lead to prosecutions, but it will give those families the truth. That's worth something, isn't it? Carolyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Yes, it is. The interview room at the State Police Barracks in Harrisburg was nothing like the interrogation chambers Sophie had seen in movies. It was almost pleasant. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, a pitcher of water on the table. They'd brought Carolyn here 3 days after the meeting in Ashford, giving her time to settle her affairs and prepare mentally for what would be an exhaustive debriefing. Sophie sat in the corner, officially present as historical consultant, but really there because Carolyn had requested it. She found the graduate student's presence comforting, she'd said, a neutral party who was interested in truth rather than convictions. Detective Moss led the questioning, with Detective Coe operating the recording equipment and taking notes. Lieutenant Marsh observed through a one-way mirror, along with a state prosecutor who had been brought in to assess whether any charges could still be filed against living accomplices. Let's start at the beginning, Moss said gently. The morning of October 8th, 1976. Take us through everything you remember. Carolyn had aged visibly in the 3 days since their meeting, the weight of her impending testimony seeming to pull her down into her chair. But her voice, when she spoke, was steady, rehearsed. She'd clearly been preparing for this conversation for decades. We met at the school. At 6:30 in the morning, everyone was excited. Mr. Brennan's parents had made cookies for the trip. Jennifer Oakes brought her camera. She wanted to photograph the cave formations for her art class. Carolyn's fingers traced the rim of her water glass. The bus was already waiting, Calvin Reeves at the wheel. He seemed nervous, kept checking his watch. But we didn't think anything of it at the time. Was there supposed to be a park ranger accompanying you? Coe asked. Yes, Ranger Mitchell. He was supposed to meet us at the school, but Mr. Reeves said Mitchell had called in sick and would meet us at the park instead. Carolyn took a sip of water. We found out later there was no Ranger Mitchell. It was just a story to get us on the bus, without adult supervision. She described the drive, the initial excitement, the sing-alongs, the gradual realization that they were taking a different route than expected. By the time the bus pulled into what looked like a hospital complex rather than a state park, some of the students were already frightened. Mr. Reeves wouldn't answer our questions, Carolyn continued. He just opened the bus door, and these 4 men in white coats came in. They had syringes. They said if we cooperated, no one would get hurt. David Chen tried to fight. He was always so brave. And one of them stuck a needle in his arm. He just collapsed. After that, we all cooperated. The room was absolutely silent, as Carolyn described being led into the west wing of Harlow, the building that officially didn't exist. They were taken to what looked like hospital rooms, but felt more like cells. White walls, a bed with restraints, a single barred window that looked out on nothing but forest. They left us alone for hours. I could hear some of the others crying, shouting. Thomas Brennan kept yelling that his father was a lawyer, that they'd all go to jail. Then the crying stopped. One by one, I heard the others go quiet. She paused, her hand shaking slightly as she reached for her water again. I was in cell number 7. They'd marked each door with a number instead of a name. It was part of the dehumanization process, I realized later, making us into subjects rather than people. When did you first meet Dr. Thorne? Moss asked. The second day. He came into my room with a clipboard and a warm smile, like this was all perfectly normal. He introduced himself as Dr. Malcolm Thorne and said I'd been selected for a special program. He called it the Tabula Rasa Project, the blank slate. His theory was that human consciousness could be wiped clean and rebuilt from scratch, that personality and memory were just programming that could be overwritten. Carolyn described the initial phase of the experiment, the isolation, the sleep deprivation, the sensory manipulation. They'd pipe white noise into the cells at random intervals, then suddenly shift to recordings of loved ones' voices, distorted and strange. They'd flash lights at irregular patterns, preventing any sense of time or routine. The worst part was the mirrors, she said quietly. Every few hours, they'd force us to stare at our reflections for extended periods while they asked us questions. Who are you? What do you want? What do you remember? And if we answered with our real names, our real memories, they'd inject us with something that made us violently ill. Classical conditioning. They were training us to reject our own identities. Sophie found herself taking notes, even though the session was being recorded. The psychological mechanisms Carolyn was describing were sophisticated, brutal, and based on actual research in behavioral modification that had been popular in the 1970s. Thorne had clearly studied the CIA's MK-Ultra experiments and adapted their techniques for his own purposes. After about a week, some of the others started to break, Carolyn continued. I could hear it in their voices during the group sessions Thorne would conduct. He'd bring us together in this large room and have us introduce ourselves. At first, everyone used their real names, but gradually, one by one, they started introducing themselves as Subject 1 or Subject 4. When that happened, Thorne would reward them. Better food, warmer blankets, kind words. Positive reinforcement for abandoning their identities, Co murmured, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. Exactly. And it worked. Within 2 weeks, I was the only one still using my real name, still insisting I was Carolyn Vestry from Millbrook. Thorne seemed frustrated by my resistance, but also fascinated. He'd spend hours with me trying different approaches. Hypnosis, drug therapy, something he called ego death meditation. But your diabetes complicated his methods, Moss said. Carolyn nodded. I needed regular insulin, or I'd go into shock. Thorne couldn't starve me the way he did some of the others, couldn't deprive me of medical care. It created gaps in his conditioning, moments of clarity when my blood sugar would spike or drop and break through whatever mental fog he'd induced. I started playing along, pretending to forget who I was, while secretly clinging to every memory I could preserve. She described the day of the photograph, October 29th, 3 weeks after their abduction. Thorne had declared the conditioning phase complete and gathered all 12 subjects in front of the West Wing for documentation. Carolyn had stood behind the camera, her mind split between the programmed subject Thorne had created and the terrified girl underneath, who was screaming silently at the horror of what had become of her friends. "They looked happy," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "That's what haunted me most. They weren't scared or angry or traumatized. They looked peaceful, content, like they'd found some kind of enlightenment." Thorne had erased everything that made them themselves and replaced it with nothing. Just blank, obedient nothing. "What was supposed to happen next?" Moss asked gently. Carolyn was silent for a long moment, gathering herself. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. The final stage was what Thorne called the separation. He believed that consciousness was separate from the physical body, that with the right techniques and conditions, you could extract a person's awareness and preserve it or transfer it to a new vessel. He'd been working on this theory for years, incorporating elements of neurology, psychology, and what he called practical mysticism. She described overhearing Thorne's conversations with his staff about the upcoming ceremony. They were going to use a combination of drugs, hypnosis, and some kind of electromagnetic apparatus to, as Thorne put it, liberate the subject's consciousness from their physical constraints. The physical bodies would be disposed of in a ritual burial that Thorne believed would complete the metaphysical transformation. "He was completely insane," Detective Coe said quietly. "No," Carolyn replied. "That's what made it so terrifying. He wasn't insane in any traditional sense. He was brilliant, methodical, absolutely convinced by his own research and theories. He believed he was on the verge of a monumental breakthrough in human understanding. The fact that it would require killing 12 children was just an unfortunate necessity for the advancement of science." Sophie felt bile rise in her throat. She'd read about similar rationalization in the records of Nazi doctors, Japanese Unit 731 researchers, people who convinced themselves that atrocity was acceptable in service of knowledge. The interview continued for another 3 hours, Carolyn providing details about the layout of the West Wing, the names of staff members she could remember, the specific drugs and techniques Thorne had employed. She described her escape in halting terms, the run through the forest, the unsuccessful attempt to get help, Thorne's decision to let her go rather than risk exposure. "Why do you think he really released you?" Moss asked. "Not the reason he gave you, but the real reason." Carolyn considered this. "I think part of him wanted a witness. He was doing what he considered revolutionary work, and the thought that it would all be secret, that no one would ever know what he'd accomplished. I think that bothered him. By letting me live, he ensured that at least one person would know, would remember, even if they could never speak about it." "But you're speaking about it now," Coe pointed out. "Because he's dead. Because I'm dying. Because those families deserve to know." Carolyn looked directly at the one-way mirror, as if she could see through it, to the prosecutor and Lieutenant Marsh beyond. "I can't give you justice. The person responsible is beyond your reach. But I can give you truth, and maybe that's worth something." The interview finally concluded, as evening fell outside. Carolyn looked exhausted, wrung out, years older than when she'd begun. Sophie helped her to a restroom, while Moss conferred with the prosecutor. "How are you holding up?" Sophie asked quietly, as Carolyn washed her face. "I feel lighter," Carolyn said, surprising her. "Like I've been carrying a weight for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Even knowing that I'm dying, even knowing that Thorne will never face justice. I'm glad I told them. I'm glad someone finally knows the whole truth." They returned to the interview room to find Lieutenant Marsh had joined Moss and the prosecutor. The lieutenant's expression was grim. "Ms. Vestry, "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. "Your testimony has been invaluable. We'll need you to come back in a few days to go through some photographs, see if you can identify any of Thorne's accomplices. In the meantime, we're going to need you to stay available." "I'm not going anywhere," Carolyn said, with a slight sad smile. "I don't have anywhere left to go." After Carolyn left with an escort who would drive her back to Ashford, the team gathered in the conference room. Lieutenant Marsh pulled up a series of documents on the screen: employment records from Harlow, financial transactions, property deeds. "We've been digging into Harlow's history while Miss Vestry was being interviewed," he said. "And we found something interesting. The West Wing construction that was supposedly halted in 1954. It wasn't halted. It was completed privately, off the books, financed through a series of shell companies, traced back to something called the Prometheus Foundation." "What's the Prometheus Foundation?" Sophie asked. "That's what we're trying to figure out. It was incorporated in 1952, dissolved in 1977, right after Thorne's death. The Foundation's stated purpose was the advancement of human consciousness through scientific research. They funded several fringe research projects in the 60s and 70s, mostly psychology and neurology studies that couldn't get mainstream funding." Detective Frame pulled up another document. "I found references to the Prometheus Foundation in declassified CIA documents related to MK-Ultra. They weren't directly involved in the program, but they had connections to several researchers who were. It looks like after MK-Ultra was exposed and shut down, some of those researchers continued their work independently, funded by organizations like Prometheus. So Thorne wasn't working alone. He was part of a larger network of researchers pursuing similar goals. Which means there might be others," Sophie added. "Other experiments, other victims." Lieutenant Marsh nodded grimly. "That's what worries me. We've identified 4 other members of the Prometheus Foundation's board of directors in 1976. 2 are dead, but 2 are still alive. One is in a nursing home in New Jersey, suffering from advanced Alzheimer's, but the other—" He brought up a photograph on the screen. Sophie's breath caught. The man in the photo was in his 70s, with silver hair and sharp eyes. But what drew her attention was his position. He was standing in front of a university building, a banner visible over his shoulder, announcing a symposium on consciousness studies. "Dr. Richard Brennan," Marsh said. "Currently a professor emeritus at Whitmore University," Sophie finished, her voice faint. "He's at my university. He's been at my university the entire time I've been researching this case." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. "There's more," Detective Fromm said quietly. "Dr. Richard Brennan had a son, Thomas Brennan, age 18 in October 1976. Sophie felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her. Thomas Brennan, one of the 12 victims, was the son of a Prometheus Foundation board member, the son of someone who had helped fund Thorne's research. "We need to talk to him," Moss said. "Now." "He's scheduled to give a lecture tomorrow afternoon," Sophie said mechanically, pulling up the university's event calendar on her phone. "On the evolution of consciousness studies over the past 50 years. Lieutenant Marsh stood. "Then tomorrow afternoon, we're going to attend a lecture. And afterward, we're going to have a very long conversation with Dr. Richard Brennan about what really happened to his son." As the meeting broke up and people gathered their materials, Sophie remained seated, staring at the photograph of Dr. Brennan on the screen. She'd seen him around campus dozens of times, passed him in hallways, maybe even nodded hello. And all that time, he'd known. He'd known what happened to those 12 students. He might have even helped plan it. The thought made her feel physically ill. Detective Moss touched her shoulder gently. "You okay?" "I don't know," Sophie admitted. "This whole time, I've been researching this case, trying to find answers, and one of the people responsible has been right there, probably watching me, knowing what I was doing." "That must have taken a special kind of coldness," Moss agreed. "To fund research that killed your own son, and then spend decades living with that secret." "Unless," Sophie said slowly, a horrible thought forming, "unless he doesn't see it as killing. Unless he believes the same thing Thorne believed, that the consciousness can be separated from the body, that his son didn't really die but was transformed, liberated something." Moss was quiet for a moment. "That would make him not just an accomplice, but a true believer. And true believers are the most dangerous kind of criminal, because they don't think they've done anything wrong." Sophie gathered her things, her hands shaking slightly. Tomorrow they would confront Dr. Brennan. Tomorrow they might finally understand the full scope of what had happened at Harlow. But tonight, she needed to go home, lock her doors, and try to sleep despite the knowledge that the past she'd been investigating wasn't safely distant at all. It was right there, teaching classes and giving lectures and walking the same halls she did, wearing a mask of academic respectability while hiding the truth about 12 children who had trusted the adults in their lives and paid for that trust with everything they were. The lecture hall was nearly full when Sophie arrived the next afternoon, sliding into a seat near the back, where she could observe without being conspicuous. Detective Moss sat 3 rows ahead of her, dressed in civilian clothes, while Detective Coe waited outside with uniformed backup in case Dr. Brennan attempted to flee. Lieutenant Marsh had decided against arresting Brennan before the lecture. They wanted to see how he behaved, what he might reveal in an unguarded moment, and whether he showed any sign of knowing they were closing in. Sophie had spent a sleepless night reviewing everything she knew about Richard Brennan. He'd joined Whitmore's faculty in 1978, just 2 years after his son's death, bringing with him an impressive research portfolio in consciousness studies and cognitive psychology. Over the decades, he'd published extensively, mentored countless graduate students, and built a reputation as one of the field's most innovative thinkers. His work focused on the boundaries between self and other, the malleability of identity, and what he called post-corporeal consciousness, the idea that human awareness might exist independent of physical form. It was, Sophie realized with growing horror, essentially a continuation of Thorne's work, refined and made academically respectable. The lights dimmed as Dr. Brennan took the stage. He moved with the careful precision of someone in his late 70s, his silver hair catching the spotlight, his expression one of benign scholarly authority. When he spoke, his voice was rich and cultured, the kind of voice that had commanded lecture halls for nearly 5 decades. "Good afternoon. Today I want to talk about how our understanding of consciousness has evolved over the past 50 years and where I believe we're headed in the next 50. He clicked to his first slide, showing a timeline. In the 1970s, we were just beginning to question the fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mind and brain. Researchers were exploring altered states, the effects of psychedelic substances, the possibility that consciousness might be more than just neurochemical processes. Sophie listened as Brennan walked through the history of consciousness research, noting how he carefully skirted around the more controversial experiments of that era. He mentioned MK-Ultra only in passing, calling it a regrettable excess, and made no reference at all to the Prometheus Foundation or any research conducted at psychiatric hospitals. "What we've learned," Brennan continued, "is that the self is far more fluid than we once believed. Identity, memory, even our sense of continuous existence, These are constructs, stories we tell ourselves. And like any story, they can be edited, revised, even completely rewritten. A student raised her hand. But isn't there something essential to who we are? Something that can't be changed or erased? Brennan smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Sophie's skin crawl. An excellent question. The traditional view holds that yes, there's some core self that persists beneath all changes. But my research suggests otherwise. I believe consciousness is more like a flame than a stone. It can be transferred, transformed, even extinguished and rekindled. And we might question whether the new flame is truly the same as the old, or something entirely different. He showed slides of his recent work, brain imaging studies, experiments in identity manipulation using virtual reality, research into how false memories could be implanted and made indistinguishable from real ones. All of it fascinating from an academic standpoint, all of it chilling when Sophie considered what might have inspired these particular lines of inquiry. Some of you may be wondering about the ethical implications of this work, Brennan said, as if reading her thoughts. If we can fundamentally alter someone's sense of self, should we? My answer is that we already do this, constantly, through education, socialization, therapy, even marketing. The question isn't whether to shape consciousness, but whether to do so deliberately and scientifically, or allow it to happen through chaotic, uncontrolled processes. Another student asked, "Have you ever conducted experiments that you later regretted, where the ethical cost was too high?" The lecture hall went very quiet. Brennan stood motionless at the podium for several long seconds, and Sophie saw something flicker across his face. Grief, perhaps, or guilt, or something more complex than either. "Yes," he said finally. "Early in my career, I was involved in research that pushed ethical boundaries too far. People were harmed, irreparably harmed, and I have spent the subsequent decades trying to understand what went wrong, trying to ensure that future research doesn't repeat those mistakes." He paused. "But I also believe that knowledge gained, even through ethically questionable means, shouldn't be wasted. We honor those who suffered by using what we learned to prevent future suffering." Sophie felt rage building in her chest. He was admitting it, or at least admitting to something, while simultaneously justifying it. 12 children weren't ethically questionable research. They were murder victims. And he was standing there, in front of students their same age, claiming their deaths had served some greater purpose. The lecture continued for another 30 minutes, Brennan outlining his vision for future consciousness research. When he finally concluded and opened the floor for final questions, Sophie found herself standing before she'd consciously decided to do so. "Dr. Brennan," she said, her voice carrying across the lecture hall, "you mentioned being involved in ethically problematic research early in your career. Can you be more specific about what that research entailed?" Brennan's eyes found her in the crowd, and she saw recognition dawn. He knew who she was, had probably known since she started her thesis research. "That's not really appropriate for this forum, Ms. Chen. If you'd like to discuss it further, you're welcome to visit my office hours. I'd prefer to discuss it now, given that my research suggests your ethically problematic work involved the disappearance and deaths of 12 high school students in 1976, including your own son." The lecture hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Brennan's face remained calm, but Sophie saw his hands grip the podium more tightly. Detective Moss had turned in his seat, watching the exchange carefully, one hand near his badge. "That's a very serious accusation," Brennan said quietly, "and one based, I suspect, on incomplete information and misunderstanding." "Then help me understand," Sophie pressed. Help me understand how a member of the Prometheus Foundation's board of directors, someone who funded Dr. Malcolm Thorne's consciousness research at Harlow Psychiatric Hospital, had a son who vanished on a field trip and ended up as Subject 1 in Thorne's Tabula Rasa project. Brennan was silent for a long moment. Then, with careful deliberation, he closed his laptop and gathered his notes. This lecture is concluded. Everyone please leave, except Ms. Chen and the gentleman in row 4, who I suspect is law enforcement. The students filed out in confused silence, many of them pulling out phones to undoubtedly post about what they'd just witnessed. When the hall was empty, except for Sophie, Moss, and Brennan, the professor descended from the stage and sat in the front row, suddenly looking every one of his 78 years. "How much do you know?" he asked quietly. Moss pulled out his badge. "Detective Raymond Moss, Pennsylvania State Police Cold Case Division. We know about the Prometheus Foundation, about the West Wing at Harlow, about the 12 students who were abducted and subjected to consciousness restructuring experiments. We have testimony from Carolyn Vestry, the only survivor, and we have physical evidence from the burial site. What we don't know is how much you personally knew and when you knew it." Brennan laughed bitterly. "I knew everything. I planned half of it." Sophie sank into a nearby seat, her legs suddenly weak. She'd suspected, but hearing him admit it so baldly was still shocking. "Thomas was brilliant," Brennan continued, his voice distant with memory. "Top of his class, accepted to Penn State, his whole future ahead of him. But he was also limited by conventional thinking, by emotional attachments, by all the psychological constraints that prevent humans from reaching their full potential. Malcolm and I believed, truly believed, that we could free him from those constraints, help him achieve a kind of pure consciousness that would allow him to transcend normal human limitations. So, you let Thorne experiment on your own son," Moss said flatly. "I didn't let him. I encouraged it. I helped select the other 11 subjects, choosing students who were bright enough to be valuable research participants, but whose disappearance wouldn't immediately trigger a massive investigation. We needed a mix of subjects to test different variables, different ages, different cognitive abilities, different baseline psychological states." Sophie felt sick. They were children. They trusted the adults in their lives. "They were volunteers," Brennan said, then caught himself. "Or rather, they would have been volunteers if we'd explained the full scope of the project. We believed informed consent was less important than the potential benefits to humanity." "That's not how consent works," Moss said, his voice hard. "And what happened to them wasn't a benefit to anyone." Brennan's composure finally cracked slightly. No, it wasn't. The process worked too well in some ways, and not well enough in others. Malcolm succeeded in erasing their previous identities, creating blank states, but he couldn't successfully imprint new consciousness patterns. They became empty, responsive but without will, present but without presence. It was like looking into their eyes and seeing nothing looking back. "So you decided to kill them," Sophie said. "Oh, Malcolm decided. I wanted to continue the research, find a way to restore them, or at least keep them alive as subjects for ongoing study. But Malcolm believed the only way forward was to attempt a separation, to try to preserve their consciousness separate from their bodies, which had become useless shells." Brennan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the campus. "I wasn't there for the final procedure. Malcolm sent me away, said it would be easier if I didn't have to watch. When I came back, it was done. 12 bodies arranged in that circle. Malcolm convinced he'd succeeded in liberating their consciousness, that they were now existing in some higher state." "You believe that?" Moss asked. "I don't know what I believe anymore. I've spent 47 years trying to replicate Malcolm's works through ethical means, trying to understand if there was any truth to his theories, or if we simply murdered 12 children for nothing. He turned back to face them. I think you can guess which conclusion my research has led me to. Sophie thought about all of Brennan's published work, his focus on the malleability of identity and the impossibility of truly separating consciousness from physical form. You've been trying to prove it was all wrong, that consciousness can't exist without a body, that what Thorne did was just murder, dressed up in scientific language. Yes, and I have proven it, again and again, through decades of careful research. But proving it doesn't bring those children back. It doesn't give me my son back. His voice broke slightly. Thomas was 18. He should have lived, should have had a career and a family, and all the normal joys and sorrows of human existence. Instead, he was erased, turned into an empty shell, and then killed as part of a ritual that accomplished nothing except proving how far human arrogance can go. Moss stood and pulled out handcuffs. Dr. Richard Brennan, you're under arrest as an accessory to 12 counts of kidnapping and 11 counts of murder. You have the right to remain silent. I'm dying, Brennan interrupted. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Same as Carolyn Vestry, ironically. I have perhaps 4 months left. You can arrest me, charge me, but I'll be dead before any trial concludes. Then you'll die in custody, Moss said, securing the handcuffs, and the families will at least have the satisfaction of knowing you were held accountable. However briefly, as Moss led Brennan toward the door, where Detective Coe waited, the professor looked back at Sophie. In my office, he said. Filing cabinet, bottom drawer, locked. The key is taped under my desk. You'll find Malcolm's complete research notes, including photographs and detailed documentation of what was done to each subject. I was going to destroy them before I died, but perhaps it's better if they go to someone who will use them to tell the truth. Sophie nodded mutely, watching as they took him away. When she was alone in the lecture hall, she sat in the silence for a long time, trying to process what she'd just heard. A father who had participated in his own son's death, convinced he was helping rather than harming. A researcher who had spent the rest of his life trying to disprove the very theories that had justified his crimes. And 12 families who would finally learn the truth about what had happened to their children. A truth so much worse than simple tragedy. Eventually, she made her way to Brennan's office. Campus security had already been notified and let her in, standing watch while she found the key and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a thick folder bound with string, the pages yellowed with age. She untied the string carefully and began to read. The documentation was exhaustive and horrifying. Thorne had recorded everything, detailed notes on each subject's psychological breakdown, photographs showing their physical deterioration over the 3 weeks of conditioning, even transcripts of their final sessions before the separation ceremony. Sophie forced herself to read through it all, bearing witness to suffering she could barely comprehend. Near the bottom of the folder was a handwritten letter addressed to whom it may concern. She recognized Thorne's handwriting from his research notes. If you are reading this, the letter began, then my work has likely been discovered and condemned. I write this defense not for legal purposes. I have no illusions about how society will judge what I have done, but for the historical record. Future researchers, perhaps centuries from now, when humanity has evolved beyond current ethical limitations, may recognize the value of what I attempted here. The Tabula Rasa project was not an act of cruelty, but of exploration. I sought to answer fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and identity. Can the self be rebuilt? Can awareness exist independent of memory and learned behavior? Can human consciousness transcend physical form? The 12 subjects provided answers to these questions, though not the answers I had hoped for. Yes, identity can be erased. The human mind is far more fragile than we like to believe. But no, it cannot be successfully rebuilt from nothing. The consciousness that emerged after the erasure was not truly consciousness at all, merely the biological machinery of awareness, operating without purpose or direction. As for transcendence, the question remains open. The separation ceremony appeared to succeed. At the moment of death, all 12 subjects exhibited unusual brain activity patterns, consistent with a consciousness attempting to persist beyond physical dissolution. Whether this represented actual survival or merely the final firing of dying neurons, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is this: I loved these children, not as individuals perhaps, but as representatives of humanity's potential. Everything I did was in service of advancing human knowledge and capability. If that makes me a monster in the eyes of my contemporaries, so be it. I accept that judgment and the isolation it brings. But I cannot accept that their deaths were meaningless. I will not accept it. And so I continue my work alone, searching for proof that some part of them survived, that their sacrifice contributed to something greater than themselves. To Richard Brennan, my colleague and friend, I know you doubt what we accomplished. I see it in your eyes when we discuss the results. But I ask you to keep faith. Continue the research through legitimate means. Perhaps you will find the answers that eluded me. To the world that will judge me, I ask only that you remember I was a scientist, not a sadist. My methods were extreme because the questions I pursued were fundamental. In a future age, when consciousness can be uploaded, downloaded, and transferred at will, my work will be recognized as pioneering rather than criminal. I go now to test my final hypothesis, whether my own consciousness can survive the deliberate destruction of my physical form. If I am correct, some part of me will persist to witness the vindication of my theories. If I am wrong, then at least I will face the same fate I imposed on my subjects, and there is a certain justice in that. Dr. Malcolm Thorne, November 12, 1976. Sophie set down the letter with shaking hands. Thorne had driven off that cliff deliberately, conducting one last experiment with himself as the subject. The arrogance, the delusion, the absolute conviction that he was serving some higher purpose. It was almost incomprehensible. She gathered all the documents and left Brennan's office, carrying the folder carefully as if it might explode. In a sense, it would. Once this material was made public, it would destroy whatever remained of Brennan's reputation and provide the families with the full, terrible truth about what had been done to their children. Outside, the campus looked impossibly normal. Students walking between classes, laughing and talking, completely unaware that in their midst, in these very buildings, such darkness had been hidden for so long. Sophie thought about Brennan teaching here for decades, mentoring students, building a career on the foundation of his son's murder. She thought about the 12 families, waiting for news, hoping against hope that she and Detective Moss would find answers. Well, they had answers now. Whether those answers brought any real comfort was another question entirely. Sophie pulled out her phone and called Moss. "I have the documents," she said when he answered. "All of Thorne's research notes, photographs, everything. You need to see this. Bring it to the station. We'll need to process it as evidence." He paused. "How are you holding up?" "I'm not sure," Sophie admitted. "This is so much worse than I imagined." Reading Thorne's justifications, seeing how he documented their suffering, like it was just data. "I don't know how to reconcile this with the image of academic research I've spent years working toward. Most research isn't this, Moss said gently. Most researchers aren't monsters. Thorne and Brennan were aberrations, not representatives. I hope you're right, because if this is what the pursuit of knowledge can become, when it's disconnected from ethics and empathy, then maybe there are some questions we shouldn't try to answer. She ended the call and walked toward her car, the folder of horrors tucked under her arm. Behind her, Whitmore University continued its daily routine, unchanged by the revelations that were about to shake it to its foundations. Tomorrow, the news would break. Brennan's arrest, Carolyn's testimony, the discovery of Thorne's complete research notes. It would all become public, and the university would have to reckon with the fact that they had employed someone who had helped murder 12 children in the name of science. But tonight, for a few more hours, Sophie carried the burden of knowing alone. And as she drove toward the police station through the gathering dusk, she found herself thinking about those 12 students, bright, promising, trusting, and how their last conscious thoughts must have been confusion and fear as the drugs took hold and their sense of self began to dissolve. She hoped they hadn't suffered long. She hoped the erasure had been quick. But Thorne's notes suggested otherwise, and that was a thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The news broke 3 days later, and the media feeding frenzy was immediate and overwhelming. Sophie watched from her apartment as reporters gathered outside Whitmore University's main gate, as news vans set up satellite equipment, as former students of Dr. Brennan were tracked down for shocked reactions and sound bites. The university issued a carefully worded statement expressing horror at the revelations and promising full cooperation with law enforcement, while simultaneously distancing themselves from crimes committed decades before most current administrators were even born. The families of the 12 victims responded in various ways. Some agreed to press conferences, standing before cameras with decades-old photographs of their children, finally able to grieve openly for deaths that had been confirmed rather than merely suspected. Others refused all media contact, processing their pain privately. Patricia Oakes, Jennifer's mother, released a single statement through her attorney. For 47 years, I have lived in a hell of not knowing. Now, I live in a different hell, one where I know exactly what was done to my daughter, and can do nothing to those responsible except watch them die of natural causes before facing any real justice. I'm not sure which is worse. Sophie had been called to testify before a grand jury about her research and the discovery of the photograph. She'd spent 6 hours walking prosecutors through everything she'd learned, providing documentation, explaining the connections she'd made. The proceeding had been emotionally exhausting, particularly when they'd shown her crime scene photographs from the burial site and asked her to identify the clothing belonging to each victim. Now, a week after Brennan's arrest, she sat in Detective Moss's office, reviewing what they'd learned from Thorne's research notes. The documents had been analyzed by forensic psychologists, medical experts, and historians, all trying to understand the full scope of what had been done. The medical examiner confirmed that the remains show signs consistent with Thorne's documented procedures, Moss said, pulling up a report on his computer. Traces of the drugs he mentioned, evidence of the restraints he described. The physical evidence corroborates the written record completely. What about the ritual aspects? Sophie asked. The symbols on the altar, the circular arrangement. Did the consultants make sense of that? Moss nodded grimly. Dr. Hadley produced a more detailed analysis. She believes Thorne was attempting to recreate a specific type of mystical ceremony found in Hermetic texts, one supposedly designed to facilitate the soul's departure from the body. He'd modified it, combined it with elements from other traditions, essentially creating a hybrid ritual that he believed would work in conjunction with the drugs and psychological conditioning to achieve consciousness separation. Did he believe it worked? According to the notes, yes. He recorded unusual EEG readings at the moment of death for all 11 subjects, brain activity patterns that persisted for several seconds after cardiac arrest and respiration ceased. He interpreted this as evidence that consciousness was attempting to persist beyond physical death. Sophie thought about that, about the possibility that in their final moments, those 11 young people had experienced something beyond simple death. She didn't know if it made things better or worse. What about Carolyn? Have you shown her the documents? Yesterday. She confirmed everything in them matches her memories. She also identified several of Thorne's assistants from photographs. We're tracking them down now. Moss leaned back in his chair, looking exhausted. 3 are dead. 2 are in nursing homes with dementia, and 1 has agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. He claims he was just following orders, didn't know the subjects were kidnapped children, thought they were legitimate psychiatric patients who had consented to experimental treatment. Do you believe him? No. But proving he knew might be difficult, and his testimony could be valuable in understanding the full network of people involved. Moss pulled up another file. We've also been investigating the Prometheus Foundation more thoroughly. It turns out they funded at least 6 other research projects in the 1970s, all involving some form of consciousness, manipulation, or behavioral modification. Most were relatively benign, studies on meditation, sensory deprivation, that sort of thing. But 2 others were concerning. He showed Sophie files on 2 additional researchers. Dr. Elena Marquez had conducted experiments on prisoners in a Texas facility, attempting to use a combination of isolation and hallucinogens to induce what she called ego dissolution and reconstruction. Dr. James Whitfield had worked with coma patients, trying to develop techniques for communicating with consciousness that was no longer able to interface with the physical world. Do we know what happened to their research subjects? Sophie asked, dreading the answer. Marquez's work was shut down by the state in 1977 after several prisoners died under suspicious circumstances. She disappeared before charges could be filed. We're still trying to locate her. Whitfield's research was less immediately harmful, but several family members of coma patients filed complaints, alleging he'd experimented on their loved ones without consent. He died in 1983, so he's beyond prosecution. Sophie felt the scope of the horror expanding. The Millbrook 12 weren't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of researchers pushing ethical boundaries in the pursuit of consciousness research. How many victims are we talking about across all these projects? We don't know yet. Dozens, certainly. Possibly hundreds, if we include subjects who survived, but were psychologically damaged. Moss closed the files. The FBI has opened a formal investigation into the Prometheus Foundation and all its associated research. This is bigger than a single cold case now. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Sophie asked the question that had been bothering her since they'd found Thorne's final letter. Do you think there's any possibility he was right? That consciousness could actually survive physical death, or be transferred, or exist independent of the body? Moss considered this carefully. I'm a cop, not a philosopher, but I've seen enough death in my career to have opinions. I think consciousness is a product of the brain, and when the brain dies, consciousness ends. Whatever Thorne saw in those EEG readings, I think it was just the biological process of dying, not evidence of transcendence. He paused. But I also think the human need to believe in something beyond death is so strong that people like Thorne can convince themselves of almost anything. He wanted to find evidence of survival, so he interpreted random neural firing as proof of consciousness persisting. It's a kind of magical thinking dressed up in scientific language. Brennan seems to have reached the same conclusion, Sophie noted. 47 years of research trying to replicate Thorne's results, all of it pointing toward consciousness being inseparable from the physical brain, which makes his involvement in the original experiment even more tragic. He helped kill his own son in pursuit of a theory that he himself later proved false. Moss stood and walked to his window, looking out at the parking lot. I've been doing this job for over 2 decades. I've seen parents do terrible things to children, abuse, neglect, murder. But usually it's motivated by anger or mental illness, or some kind of immediate gratification. What Brennan did was different. He sacrificed his son for an abstract idea, a hypothesis. That kind of cold, intellectual cruelty is somehow worse than hot-blooded violence. Sophie joined him at the window. Have you spoken to him since the arrest? Briefly. He's been cooperative, providing names and details, but emotionally he seems completely shut down. The cancer is progressing quickly. The doctors think he has maybe 6 weeks left. The prosecutor is pushing to get a trial scheduled immediately, but Brennan's lawyers are arguing he's too ill. It'll probably end up being a deathbed confession rather than a formal trial. And then he dies, having faced minimal consequences for what he did. Yes, but at least the truth is known now. The families have answers. Carolyn can die knowing she fulfilled her promise to speak out. That's not justice in any satisfying sense, but it's something. Sophie's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and felt her stomach drop. It's from the university. They're suspending my research access, pending an ethics review of my involvement in the investigation. Moss frowned. On what grounds? Conflict of interest, conducting research that led to criminal charges against a faculty member, potential violation of research protocols. They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. She sat down heavily. They're protecting their reputation. Can't have it known that a graduate student uncovered evidence of murder that the university should have found decades ago. That's garbage, and you know it. Your research was impeccable, and you followed proper channels once you discovered evidence of criminal activity. Doesn't matter. Academic politics aren't about truth or ethics. They're about liability and public relations. Sophie felt tears of frustration welling up. I've spent 3 years on this research. It was going to be my dissertation, my career foundation, and now they're going to bury it to protect themselves. Then you publish independently, Moss said firmly. Write a book, do a documentary, find a way to tell this story that doesn't require university approval. The families deserve to have someone tell the complete truth about what happened, and you're the person who knows it best. Sophie wiped her eyes considering this. You think people would want to read about something this dark? I think people need to understand how institutional failures and unchecked authority can lead to atrocities. The Millbrook 12 didn't die in some random act of violence. They died because multiple systems failed to protect them. The school that organized an unsupervised field trip. The parents who trusted institutional authority without question. The medical establishment that allowed someone like Thorne to operate. The academic community that funded his research without ethical oversight. And the law enforcement system that failed to investigate thoroughly enough when they first disappeared. Moss returned to his desk and pulled out a business card. There's a journalist I know who specializes in investigative crime stories. Let me connect you two. This story needs to be told, and it needs to be told right. Before Sophie could respond, there was a knock on the door. Detective Coe entered, her expression troubled. "We have a problem. Carolyn Vestry is in the hospital. Complications from the cancer. She's asking for Sophie." Sophie grabbed her jacket immediately. "Which hospital?" "St. Catherine's in Ashford." "But Sophie, the doctors say it's not good. They're not sure she'll make it through the night." The drive to Ashford felt endless, though Sophie made it in just over 2 hours. She found Carolyn in a private room, connected to various monitors, her face pale against the white pillows. She opened her eyes when Sophie entered and managed a weak smile. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I came." Sophie took the chair beside the bed and gently held Carolyn's hand. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm dying," which I suppose is accurate. Carolyn's breathing was labored, each word clearly an effort. "Did Brennan confess? Did he tell them everything?" "Yes. He confirmed everything you told us. The investigation has expanded to include other Prometheus Foundation projects. The truth is coming out." "Good. That's good." Carolyn closed her eyes briefly. "I need to tell you something. Something I didn't mention before, because I wasn't sure it was real or just trauma-induced delusion." Sophie leaned closer. "What is it?" "The night of the separation ceremony, when they killed the others, I told you I'd escaped before it happened. But that's not entirely true. I was there. I watched from hiding in a ventilation shaft I discovered while exploring. I couldn't save them, but I thought I should bear witness." Sophie's grip on Carolyn's hand tightened. "What did you see?" "They drugged them first, all 11 arranged in that circle. Thorne was in the center, wearing some kind of ceremonial robe, reading from a book that looked ancient. His assistants were monitoring equipment, recording everything. And as the drugs took effect and the subjects started to die, the machines started going crazy, all kinds of readings that didn't make sense." Carolyn paused, gathering strength. "But that's not the strange part. The strange part was what happened after. After they were all dead, after the machines had flatlined, there was this moment of absolute silence. And then, I know this sounds insane, but the air seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from pavement. And I felt something pass through me, through the shaft where I was hiding. It was like a wind, but not a wind. More like a presence, or multiple presences, moving past me toward, I don't know where. Away." "You think you felt their consciousness leaving?" "I don't know what I felt. It could have been carbon monoxide from the ventilation system. It could have been my own terror and guilt, manifesting as hallucination. But in that moment, I believed I was experiencing something real, that some part of them was escaping, going somewhere beyond Thorne's control." Sophie didn't know what to say. She'd spent the past weeks dealing in facts and evidence, and this testimony was something else entirely. Subjective, unverifiable, but delivered with absolute sincerity by a dying woman who had no reason to lie. "I've never told anyone that before," Carolyn continued. "I was afraid people would think I was crazy, or that they'd use it to discredit my testimony about the concrete facts. But you should know. Maybe Thorne was partially right, not about the science, but about the possibility of something beyond. Or maybe I just wanted to believe my friends' deaths weren't completely meaningless." "I don't think their deaths were meaningless," Sophie said gently. "They exposed a network of unethical research. They led to changes in how human subject research is regulated. And they brought you to the point where you could finally tell the truth. That's not nothing." Carolyn smiled again, more peacefully this time. "Thank you for that. And thank you for listening, for investigating, for caring about 12 kids who disappeared before you were even born. You didn't have to do any of this." "Yes, I did." Once I saw that photograph, once I knew there were answers to be found, I couldn't walk away." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Sophie holding Carolyn's hand as the monitors beeped rhythmically. A nurse came in to check vitals, adjusted something on one of the machines, and left again with a sympathetic look. "Sophie," Carolyn said eventually, her voice even weaker than before, "when you tell this story, however you end up telling it, don't let it be just about the horror. Talk about who they were before. Jennifer wanted to be an artist. Thomas was going to study engineering. Melissa played violin and wanted to join an orchestra. They were people with dreams and futures, not just victims of a madman. I promise. And tell the families. Tell them I'm sorry I didn't save them. Sorry I ran. Sorry I stayed silent for so long. You have nothing to apologize for. You were a victim too, and you survived against impossible odds. That took tremendous strength." Carolyn's eyes drifted closed. "I'm so tired." "Then rest. I'll stay here with you." "Thank you," Carolyn whispered. And then, so quietly Sophie almost missed it, "I hope they were right. I hope there's something after. I'd like to see them again and tell them I'm sorry." Sophie stayed through the night, holding Carolyn's hand, as her breathing grew more labored, and then finally ceased. The monitors alarmed. Nurses rushed in, but there was nothing to be done. Carolyn Vestry, the last survivor of the Millbrook 12, died at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November 2023, 47 years and 1 month after her friends had been murdered in the basement of Harlow Psychiatric Hospital. As Sophie watched the nurses turn off the machines and prepare Carolyn's body, she found herself thinking about what Carolyn had described. That sensation of something passing by, moving toward some unknown destination. She didn't believe in souls or consciousness existing independent of the brain. She was a researcher, trained in evidence and empiricism. But standing there in that hospital room, with dawn just beginning to lighten the sky outside, Sophie found herself hoping that Carolyn had been right. That somewhere, somehow, 12 young people who had been erased and destroyed were somehow still existing, still aware, still themselves. It was irrational and unscientific, but grief made room for hope that logic couldn't accommodate. She left the hospital as the sun rose, driving back toward Harrisburg, with tears streaming down her face. She'd lost a source, but more than that, she'd lost someone who had become a friend in their brief time together. Someone who had carried an impossible burden with grace and had finally laid it down. Sophie pulled over at a rest stop and called Detective Moss. "Carolyn died this morning," she said when he answered. "I'm sorry. I know you'd gotten close to her. She told me something before she died, something I'm not sure what to do with." She relayed Carolyn's final story about the separation ceremony, about the sensation of presences moving past her. Moss listened without interruption. "Do you think she was hallucinating?" Sophie asked when she'd finished. "I think she believed what she was telling you. Whether it was real or a trauma response, I can't say. Does it matter?" "I don't know. It feels important, but I can't explain why." "Sometimes," Moss said thoughtfully, "the most important truths aren't the ones we can prove. They're the ones that give people peace." If Carolyn found peace in believing her friend's consciousness survived in some form, then that belief served a purpose, whether it was objectively true or not. Sophie wiped her eyes. "When did you become a philosopher?" 23 years of working cold cases will do that to you. You see enough tragedy, you start looking for meaning wherever you can find it. They talked for a few more minutes, then ended the call. Sophie sat in her car, watching early morning traffic flow past on the highway. and made a decision. She would write this story. Not as an academic dissertation. The university could keep their research access and their ethics reviews. She would write it as a book, a comprehensive account of what had happened to the Millbrook 12, who they had been, what had been done to them, and how their deaths had finally been uncovered. And she would include Carolyn's final testimony about the separation ceremony, not as proven fact, but as the experience of someone who had been there. Let readers decide for themselves what it meant. Let the families find whatever comfort they could in the possibility that their children's consciousness had survived in some form, even if their bodies hadn't. It wouldn't be justice, it wouldn't bring anyone back, but it would be truth, or at least as close to truth as she could get. And sometimes, truth was the only memorial worth building. Richard Brennan died 6 weeks after his arrest, exactly as the doctors had predicted. He never stood trial, but in his final days, he gave a series of recorded interviews to prosecutors, law enforcement, and finally to Sophie herself. The interviews were conducted in a hospice facility. Brennan propped up in bed, connected to morphine drips that kept his pain manageable, but left his mind relatively clear. Sophie arrived for their scheduled interview on a cold December morning, carrying her recording equipment and a list of questions she'd compiled. A nurse led her to Brennan's room, warning her that he tired easily and might not be able to answer everything she wanted to ask. The man in the bed bore little resemblance to the commanding professor who had stood at the lecture hall podium just weeks earlier. Cancer had ravaged his body, leaving him skeletal and jaundiced, his silver hair now thin and brittle. But his eyes were still sharp, still intelligent, and when he saw Sophie, he attempted a smile. "Miss Chen, thank you for coming." "Dr. Brennan." Sophie set up her equipment, noting how her hands shook slightly. Despite everything she knew about this man, about what he'd done, there was something deeply unsettling about interviewing someone on their deathbed. "Before we begin," Brennan said, his voice weak but steady, "I want to apologize. Not for what I did to my son and the others. I've come to accept that no apology can address that magnitude of wrong. But for allowing you to research this case for years while knowing the truth, watching you pursue leads while I could have simply told you everything. That was cruel in a different way, and I'm sorry for it." Sophie turned on the recorder. "Why didn't you tell me? If you wanted the truth known, if you've spent 47 years trying to disprove Thorne's theories, why let me stumble around in the dark?" "Because I'm a coward," Brennan said simply. "I told myself I was waiting for the right time, that I needed to complete my research first, that exposure would prevent me from continuing my work. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of prosecution, afraid of public condemnation, afraid of having to finally face what I'd done. It was easier to let you do the hard work, while I observed from a safe distance. Until Carolyn sent me the photograph. Yes. When you showed up at my lecture with that, I knew the investigation would move forward with or without my cooperation. So I made the choice to confess, to provide documentation, to try in some small way to facilitate truth rather than continue obstructing it." Sophie consulted her notes. "I want to understand the timeline. When did you first meet Dr. Thorne?" Brennan settled back against his pillows, his gaze distant with memory. 1972. We were both presenting at a consciousness studies conference in Boston. Malcolm gave a paper on identity dissolution and reconstruction that was brilliant but disturbing. Even then, he was pushing ethical boundaries in his thinking. We got drinks afterward, discovered we shared similar theoretical interests, and began corresponding regularly. Over the next hour, he walked Sophie through the development of their collaboration. Thorne's research position at Harlow, the formation of the Prometheus Foundation as a funding mechanism for projects that mainstream institutions wouldn't support. The gradual escalation from theoretical discussions to actual experimental planning. The idea for using adolescent subjects came from Malcolm, Brennan said. He argued that adult consciousness was too rigid, too entrenched in established patterns to be successfully restructured. But adolescent minds were still plastic, still forming. They'd be ideal subjects for testing whether identity could be erased and rebuilt. And you agreed with this reasoning? I did. God help me, I did. We convinced ourselves we were doing something noble, advancing human understanding, potentially developing therapies that could help people trapped in damaging thought patterns or traumatic memories. We used all the standard academic justifications for pushing ethical boundaries. When did your son become involved? Brennan's expression crumpled slightly. I approached Thomas in the summer of 1976, told him about the research, though not the full extent of what it would involve. I presented it as a unique opportunity to be part of groundbreaking science. He was brilliant and curious, and I used that curiosity against him. I told him the experience would give him insights that would benefit his future career. He trusted me completely. Did he know the other 11 subjects? Some of them, yes. They were all top students from the same school. Malcolm and I selected them carefully. Children from stable homes who wouldn't be immediately missed during a weekend trip. Children bright enough to be valuable subjects, but without connections to law enforcement or media that might trigger intensive investigation. We thought we'd planned for everything. Sophie felt sick, hearing him describe the selection process so clinically. How did you persuade the school to organize the field trip? Money. The Prometheus Foundation made a generous donation to the biology department on the condition they organize educational excursions. We suggested the cave trip specifically, knowing the remote location would provide opportunities for the subjects to be diverted without witnesses. Malcolm arranged for the regular ranger to be called away on false pretenses, and he paid Calvin Reeves to drive the bus to Harlow instead of the park. What happened to Reeves? Why did he have a breakdown? Malcolm gave him more information than he should have. Reeves wasn't just a paid accomplice. Malcolm tried to recruit him as an assistant, showed him some of the initial conditioning process. Reeves was horrified, tried to back out, threatened to go to police. Malcolm panicked and gave him a massive dose of the same drugs he was using on the subjects. It shattered Reeves' mind. Malcolm claimed it was an accident, that he'd miscalculated the dosage, but I've always suspected he did it deliberately to ensure Reeves could never testify coherently about what he'd witnessed. They continued for another 30 minutes, Brennan providing details about the 3 weeks of conditioning, the drugs used, the psychological techniques employed. His descriptions matched Carolyn's testimony and Thorne's written records precisely. Tell me about October 29th, Sophie said. The day of the photograph. Brennan closed his eyes. That was supposed to be the completion of the first phase. Malcolm had succeeded in breaking down their previous identities, creating what he called blank cognitive states. He was triumphant, convinced this proved his theories about the malleability of consciousness. He wanted to document it, create a record of his achievement. Why did he have Carolyn take the photograph instead of one of the assistants? Because she was the only subject who had partially resisted the conditioning. Malcolm thought having her document the success of the process with the others would be the final step in her own breakdown, forcing her to see what she'd failed to become, showing her that resistance was futile. But it had the opposite effect. Yes, Malcolm didn't account for her diabetes creating gaps in the conditioning, moments of clarity when her blood sugar fluctuated. He underestimated her will. Brennan's voice, filled with something that might have been respect. Carolyn Vestry was stronger than any of us gave her credit for. Did you attend the separation ceremony? No, I couldn't. Brennan's composure finally broke, tears sliding down his wasted cheeks. I went to Harlow the night before, saw what my son had become. He looked at me without recognition, responded to commands like an automaton. There was nothing of Thomas left in that shell. And I realized what we'd done, what I'd done. I begged Malcolm to stop, to try to reverse the process. But he said it was too late. The subjects were too far gone to recover their original personalities. The only path forward was the separation, attempting to preserve whatever consciousness remained in a form that didn't require the damaged bodies. Did you believe that was possible? I wanted to believe it. Malcolm was so convinced, so certain. He'd found a way to prove consciousness could exist independent of physical form. And the alternative, accepting that we'd destroyed 12 young lives for nothing, was too horrible to contemplate. Brennan wiped his eyes weakly. So I left, drove back to Whitmore, and waited for Malcolm to tell me the results. When he called the next morning, he said it had worked, that the separation had succeeded, that he'd recorded evidence of consciousness persisting after physical death. He was ecstatic. Did you see this evidence? He showed me EEG recordings, electromagnetic readings, various data points he claimed demonstrated persistent consciousness. I wanted to believe him, but even then, I had doubts. The data was ambiguous at best and could be interpreted multiple ways. But Malcolm was absolutely certain, and I needed to believe him. Because if he was wrong, then Thomas and the others had died for nothing. Sophie leaned forward. And your subsequent research? The decades you spent trying to replicate consciousness transfer? Was that an attempt to validate Thorne's work or disprove it? Both. Neither. I don't know anymore. Brennan looked exhausted, pain breaking through despite the medication. I told myself I was continuing the research, to honor Thomas's sacrifice, to ensure his death contributed to human knowledge. But looking back, I think I was trying to prove it had all been a terrible mistake, that consciousness can't be separated from the body, that Malcolm had been wrong, and we'd simply committed murder, dressed up in scientific language. And what did your research conclude? That consciousness is an emergent property of the physical brain. When the brain dies, consciousness ends. There is no soul, no separable awareness, no possibility of transfer or survival. Every experiment I conducted, every study I reviewed, pointed to the same conclusion. Malcolm Thorne was a brilliant man who deluded himself into believing his desire for transcendence could overcome biological reality. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Sophie asked her final question. Do you believe your son suffered? Brennan's face contorted with anguish. Yes. The conditioning process was brutal, designed to break down psychological defenses through a combination of sensory deprivation, chemical intervention, and targeted trauma. Even if the final separation was painless, and I have no reason to believe it was, the 3 weeks leading up to it would have been agony. Thomas died terrified, confused, and alone, having been betrayed by the person he trusted most in the world. That knowledge has poisoned every day of my life since. Why didn't you confess earlier? Why wait until you were dying? Cowardice, as I said, and perhaps a delusional hope that I could somehow make amends through my research, prove that consciousness transcendence was impossible, and thus prevent anyone from attempting similar experiments. But I see now, that was just rationalization. The only real amends would have been immediate confession and cooperation with law enforcement, allowing the families to have answers and preventing me from benefiting personally from my crimes. The interview continued for another 15 minutes before Brennan became too tired to speak coherently. Sophie gathered her equipment and prepared to leave, but Brennan called her back. "The families," he said weakly. "Have any of them asked to speak with me?" "Several have. Thomas's mother wants to see you before you die." Brennan closed his eyes. "Tell her I'll see her whenever she wishes. Tell her I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it, but it's all I have left to offer." Sophie left the hospice and sat in her car for a long time, processing what she'd heard. Brennan's confession was comprehensive, detailed, and utterly damning. It would form the centerpiece of her book, the primary source for understanding the psychological and institutional factors that had enabled the Millbrook 12 tragedy. But more than that, it was a case study in how intelligent people could convince themselves to do monstrous things. Brennan hadn't been a sadist or a psychopath. He'd been a respected researcher, a dedicated scholar, someone who genuinely believed he was pursuing important knowledge. And yet he'd participated in the murder of 12 children, including his own son, and had kept silent about it for nearly half a century. Over the following weeks, Sophie conducted similar interviews with other participants. The assistant who'd been granted immunity provided details about the day-to-day operations at Harlow. Family members of the victims shared memories of who their children had been before the disappearance. Medical experts analyzed Thorne's techniques and explained the psychological mechanisms he'd exploited. She also tracked down 2 elderly women who had been patients at Harlow in 1976 and remembered seeing the 12 students. They described young people who seemed drugged and compliant, who moved like puppets on strings, who had frightened the other patients with their blank expressions and mechanical responses. "We called them the Hollow Children," one woman said, her voice shaking with the memory. "They looked like real people, but there was nothing behind their eyes. It was like looking at perfect mannequins. Some of us complained to the staff, said something bad was happening to those kids, but we were just crazy patients. Nobody listened to us." This testimony particularly haunted Sophie. Even people dismissed as mentally ill had recognized that something terrible was happening, but the institutional authority of Thorne and his medical credentials had silenced those concerns. The victims had been hidden in plain sight, their suffering witnessed but not acted upon. As she compiled her research into a manuscript, Sophie found herself returning again and again to Carolyn's final testimony about the separation ceremony, the sensation of presences moving past her, going somewhere beyond. She interviewed neuroscientists, consciousness researchers, even a few open-minded philosophers about whether such experiences could have any basis in reality. The consensus was clear. Whatever Carolyn had experienced was almost certainly a combination of trauma, sensory distortion from the ventilation system, and the human mind's tendency to create narrative meaning from random phenomena. There was no scientific support for consciousness existing independent of the brain, no evidence that any part of the 12 victims had survived their physical deaths. And yet Sophie found herself including Carolyn's testimony in her manuscript anyway, not as proof of transcendence, but as an example of how desperately humans need to believe that death isn't the final end, that consciousness continues somehow. Whether Carolyn's experience was real or imagined, it had given her comfort, and perhaps that was worth something. Richard Brennan died on January 14, 2024, 3 days after a 2-hour visit from Thomas's mother that left both of them emotionally devastated. He was buried quietly, with no memorial service, his obituary mentioning only his early academic work and omitting the final years of his life entirely. The university removed his name from a building that had been dedicated to him and established a scholarship fund for ethics studies in what they hoped would be seen as appropriate penance. Sophie attended his funeral, one of only 7 people present. She watched as they lowered his casket into the frozen ground and thought about all the damage one man could do when he convinced himself that the ends justified the means, that abstract knowledge was worth more than human lives, that his intellectual brilliance exempted him from normal moral constraints. As she walked away from the grave, her phone rang. Detective Moss, calling with news. "We found Elena Marquez," he said. "She's been living under an assumed name in New Mexico for the past 40 years. Local police picked her up this morning. She's willing to talk about the Prometheus Foundation and the other research projects they funded." "How many other victims?" "She claims to know about at least 40 across all the projects combined. We're looking at one of the largest unethical research scandals in modern American history." Sophie felt simultaneously vindicated and horrified. The Millbrook 12 weren't an isolated tragedy, but part of a systematic pattern of abuse enabled by institutional failure and the unchecked authority granted to researchers. "I'm finishing the manuscript," she told Moss. "The book should be ready for publication by spring." "Good. These stories need to be told, not just for the victims, but to prevent it from happening again." After ending the call, Sophie stood in the cemetery for a few more minutes, looking back at Brennan's grave. A life that had started with promise and ended in disgrace, leaving behind nothing but damage and regret. She thought about Thomas Brennan, about Carolyn Vestry, about all 12 students who had trusted adults to protect them and had been betrayed in the worst possible way. Then she left the cemetery and drove back to her apartment, where her manuscript waited. She had work to do, stories to tell, truth to document. It wouldn't bring anyone back. It wouldn't undo the harm, but it would ensure that the Millbrook 12 were remembered not just as victims, but as whole people whose lives had been stolen from them. And sometimes, memory was the only justice that remained possible. The book was published in September 2024, nearly a year after the photograph had arrived at Sophie's office. She'd titled it "The Hollow Children, the Millbrook 12, and the Death of Innocence," and it became an immediate bestseller, tapping into public fascination with true crime, while also serving as a serious examination of research ethics and institutional accountability. Sophie spent the fall on a book tour, speaking at universities, libraries, and bookstores across the country. At each event, she would read selections from the manuscript, show the infamous photograph on a screen behind her, and answer questions from audiences who were by turns horrified, fascinated, and desperate to understand how such atrocities could happen in civilized society. The families of the victims had mixed reactions to the book. Some felt it honored their children's memories, giving them back their humanity by focusing on who they'd been before the tragedy. Others felt it exploited their pain for commercial gain, no matter how sensitively Sophie had tried to handle the subject matter. She understood both perspectives and accepted that she couldn't please everyone. What mattered most was that the truth was now public record. Children in schools were learning about the Millbrook 12 as a cautionary tale about the importance of oversight and ethical guidelines in research. Medical schools were using excerpts from the book in their bioethics courses, and most importantly, the victims' names and stories were being preserved for future generations. But the aspect of the book that generated the most controversy was Sophie's inclusion of Carolyn's testimony about the separation ceremony, particularly the description of presences moving past her. Critics accused Sophie of sensationalism, of giving credence to supernatural claims in what should have been a purely factual account. Supporters argued that she was simply recording one witness's subjective experience without claiming it as objective truth. The debate reached a peak when Sophie appeared on a national news program to discuss the book. The host, a sharp-eyed journalist named Amanda Warren, brought up the controversial passage immediately. "You include a description of consciousness surviving death," Warren said, "based on the testimony of a single witness who was admittedly traumatized and possibly suffering from carbon monoxide exposure. Why include something so scientifically dubious in an otherwise well-researched book?" Sophie had anticipated this question and had her response prepared. "I included it because Carolyn Vestry believed it was important enough to share with me in her final hours. Whether what she experienced was objectively real or a trauma response, it was real to her, and it shaped how she processed what happened to her friends. Excluding it would have been dishonest. I'm not claiming consciousness can survive death. I'm reporting that one person believed they witnessed it. But doesn't including it undermine the scientific framework of the rest of your book? I don't think so. Science isn't just about what we can prove. It's also about honestly recording observations, even ones we can't fully explain. Carolyn's experience is documented fact. How we interpret that experience is where subjective judgment comes in." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, touching on the broader implications of the Prometheus Foundation's activities, the criminal charges that were still being filed against surviving participants, and the changes in research oversight that had resulted from the investigation. After the interview, Sophie returned to her hotel room exhausted. Her phone showed dozens of messages, some supportive, some critical, some from researchers and journalists who wanted to discuss various aspects of the case. She scrolled through them mechanically, responding to the most urgent and flagging others for later. One message caught her attention. It was from an unknown number, the text simple and direct. "I knew one of the 12. I need to talk to you. Please call." A phone number followed. Sophie hesitated, then dialed. A woman answered on the second ring, her voice elderly and hesitant. "Hello? This is Sophie Chen. You sent me a message about knowing one of the Millbrook 12? "Yes. My name is Dorothy Grayson. Melissa Grayson was my daughter." Sophie's heart rate increased. Dorothy Grayson had declined all interview requests during her research, had refused to participate in the investigation or contribute to the book. Sophie had respected that decision, using only publicly available information about Melissa in her writing. "Mrs. Grayson, I'm honored you called. What can I do for you?" "I read your book," Dorothy said. "The part about Carolyn Vestry, about what she claimed to experience during the ceremony. I need to tell you something that happened to me that night." Sophie grabbed her laptop, opening a new document. "I'm listening." October 31st, 1976. I was at home, had been for weeks, in a state of absolute despair. Melissa had been missing for 23 days. The police had found nothing. I'd barely slept, barely eaten. Around midnight, I suddenly woke up feeling like Melissa was in the room with me. Dorothy's voice shook slightly. "I know how that sounds. Grief does strange things to the mind, creates hallucinations and false comfort. But this felt different. It felt absolutely real. I sat up in bed, and I could sense her there, not visually, but present. And I heard her voice, clear as anything, saying, 'Goodbye, Mama. I love you. Don't be sad.'" Sophie typed rapidly, capturing every word. "Did you tell anyone about this at the time?" "I told my husband. He thought I was having a breakdown, wanted me to see a psychiatrist. I didn't mention it to the police because I knew they'd dismiss it. And over the years, I convinced myself it had been a dream or a delusion brought on by grief and sleep deprivation." She paused. "But when I read about Carolyn's experience in your book, about presences moving past her that same night, I wondered if maybe it wasn't entirely in my head." Mrs. Grayson, I have to be honest with you. The scientific consensus is that consciousness doesn't survive death. That what both you and Carolyn experienced were probably psychological responses to extreme trauma and grief. I know that. I'm an educated woman, Miss Chen. I understand biology and neurology. But I also know what I experienced. And I know that for 47 years, that moment of feeling Melissa's presence has been the only real comfort I've had. Whether it was real or imagined doesn't change the fact that it helped me survive. They talked for another hour, Dorothy sharing memories of Melissa, her artistic talent, her infectious laugh, her dreams of studying art in Paris. She also shared her thoughts on the investigation and the book, expressing gratitude that the truth had finally emerged, even as she mourned that it had taken so long. "Do you think Thorne really believed consciousness could survive?" Dorothy asked. "Or was he just a monster dressing up murder in scientific language?" "I think he genuinely believed it," Sophie said, "which in some ways makes it worse. He wasn't trying to cause harm for harm's sake. He was pursuing what he thought was revolutionary knowledge, and the fact that it required destroying children's minds and bodies was acceptable collateral damage in his worldview." "Ah, that's the part I can't forgive," Dorothy said quietly. "Not the murder itself, as terrible as that is, but the arrogance, the absolute certainty that his intellectual curiosity mattered more than human lives. How does a person become that disconnected from basic empathy? I don't know. I've thought about that question constantly while researching this book. Brennan seemed to have maintained some capacity for guilt and regret, however inadequate. But Thorne, based on everything I've learned about him, appears to have been completely convinced of his own righteousness until the very end." After saying goodbye to Dorothy, Sophie sat in her hotel room, thinking about the conversation. She'd now heard two separate accounts of consciousness-related experiences on October 31st, 1976. Carolyn's sensation of presences passing by, and Dorothy's feeling of Melissa's goodbye. Both could be explained as grief and trauma. But the coincidence of timing bothered her. She pulled up her research files and checked the timeline. Carolyn had estimated the separation ceremony occurred around 11 p.m. Dorothy had experienced her moment of connection around midnight. Allowing for Carolyn's time estimate being approximate, the two experiences could have been nearly simultaneous. Sophie made a note to reach out to other families, ask if any of them had experienced similar phenomena on that night. It wouldn't prove anything scientifically, but it would be interesting data, another piece of the puzzle that was the Millbrook 12 case. Over the following weeks, she conducted quiet interviews with the other families who would speak to her. 3 reported unusual experiences around that date, dreams that felt more real than normal dreams, sensations of their missing children being nearby, moments of inexplicable peace in the middle of overwhelming grief. Were these experiences evidence of actual consciousness survival? Almost certainly not, Sophie concluded. More likely they represented the human mind's powerful need to create meaning and connection in the face of unbearable loss. The brain is remarkably good at generating experiences that comfort us, especially in extreme situations. But she also recognized that for the families, the truth of these experiences mattered less than their impact. If believing they'd somehow sensed their children's final goodbye helped them cope with tragedy, who was she to definitively declare it false? The controversy over this aspect of the book continued for months, with Sophie finding herself caught between skeptics who accused her of promoting pseudoscience and believers who felt she hadn't gone far enough in validating consciousness survival. She tried to maintain a middle position, acknowledging the experiences as reported, while not claiming them as proof of anything beyond the power of human psychology. In December 2024, 15 months after the investigation began, the final legal proceedings concluded. Several of Thorne's surviving assistants pled guilty to various charges and received prison sentences. The nursing home residents with dementia were deemed incompetent to stand trial. Elena Marquez was sentenced to 20 years for her role in the Texas prison experiments, and the Prometheus Foundation's remaining assets were seized and distributed among victims' families as restitution. Sophie attended the final sentencing hearing, watching as the judge delivered a statement about the importance of research ethics and the consequences of unchecked scientific authority. The families were there too, some satisfied that justice had finally been served, others frustrated that the primary perpetrators, Thorne and Brennan, had escaped punishment through death. After the hearing, Sophie stood outside the courthouse speaking with Patricia Oakes, now 79, and using a walker but still sharp and present. "Do you think this makes a difference?" Patricia asked. "All the trials and sentences and investigations? Does it change anything?" "It changes that the truth is known," Sophie said. "That people can't pretend it didn't happen or dismiss it as conspiracy theory. And maybe it prevents something similar from happening again." "Maybe," Patricia echoed, sounding unconvinced. "But Jennifer is still dead. She's been dead for 48 years. I'm an old woman now. I've outlived my daughter by decades. All this truth and justice doesn't bring her back or give me the life I should have had watching her grow up." Sophie didn't have a response to that. Patricia was right. Justice was cold comfort at best, and the truth, however important, couldn't undo the past. They stood together in the December cold, two women connected by tragedy and investigation, understanding that some losses were too profound for any resolution to heal. "Thank you for writing the book," Patricia said finally, "for making people remember Jennifer as a person, not just a victim. That matters to me, even if nothing else does." After Patricia left, Sophie remained outside the courthouse for a few more minutes, watching people come and go, conducting the ordinary business of law and life. Somewhere in that courthouse, someone was getting divorced, someone was adopting a child, someone was fighting a speeding ticket. Normal human conflicts and processes, far removed from the darkness she'd spent the past year documenting. She thought about the 12 students who had left for a field trip one October morning in 1976, excited and laughing, with no idea what awaited them. She thought about Carolyn Vestry, who had survived but carried the weight of that survival for nearly 5 decades. She thought about the families who had lived with absence and uncertainty, and how finally having answers hadn't truly closed the wounds that never quite healed. And she thought about Malcolm Thorne, driving deliberately off a cliff, convinced to his last moment that he'd succeeded in proving consciousness could transcend physical death. Whether he'd been right or delusional, visionary or monster, was a question that might never have a definitive answer. Sophie pulled out her phone and opened her email. There were requests for speaking engagements, messages from readers, interview requests from podcasts and documentaries. The Millbrook 12 case would continue to generate interest, to be studied and analyzed and debated. Her book had ensured that. But for Sophie personally, this chapter was closing. She'd told the story she'd set out to tell, honored the victims as best she could, and contributed to a conversation about ethics and oversight that might prevent future tragedies. It was time to move on to whatever came next. She started walking back to her car, her breath visible in the cold air, her footsteps echoing on the courthouse steps. Behind her, the building stood solid and imposing, a monument to the idea that truth and justice were worth pursuing even when they came too late to matter. And somewhere, in whatever form consciousness took, after death, if any, 12 young people existed in memory and story, their lives and deaths a permanent reminder of what could go wrong when science divorced itself from humanity. Sophie reached her car and sat inside for a moment before starting the engine. On the passenger seat lay a copy of her book, the photograph of the 12 students on the cover, their vacant eyes staring at nothing. She'd looked at that image hundreds of times now, studied every detail, tried to see past the emptiness to the people they'd been before. She couldn't see them. Whatever the tabula rasa project had taken from those students, it had been complete and irreversible. The people they'd been were gone, erased as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. But Sophie had written their stories anyway, had recorded their dreams and hopes, their personalities and quirks, everything that had made them individuals before Thorne reduced them to subjects and then to bodies arranged in a ritual circle. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. She started the car and drove away from the courthouse, leaving the Millbrook 12 case behind her. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but no longer the center of her daily existence. The December sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city. And as Sophie navigated traffic toward home, she thought about Carolyn's final words. I hope there's something after. Whether that hope was justified or just another story humans told themselves to make death bearable, Sophie still didn't know. But she understood why people needed to believe it. In a world where 12 bright children could be destroyed for no good reason, where parents could outlive their children by decades, where truth came too late and justice remained incomplete. In that world, hope for something beyond was sometimes the only thing that made any of it endurable. And maybe that was enough. 5 years later, Sophie stood in the archives of Whitmore University, now Dr. Sophie Chen, having completed her doctorate with a dissertation on institutional accountability in research ethics. The university had eventually lifted their sanctions and even offered her a position as an assistant professor in their Department of History, specializing in the ethics of scientific research. She'd accepted, seeing it as an opportunity to ensure future students understood the lessons of cases like the Millbrook 12. Every semester, she taught a course on research ethics that used the case as a central example, walking students through how seemingly reasonable people could convince themselves to do unconscionable things. Today, she was preparing materials for a symposium marking the 50th anniversary of the disappearances. The university was hosting a memorial event, finally acknowledging their failure to investigate suspicious activities at a nearby institution and their decades-long employment of Richard Brennan, despite his involvement in mass murder. Sophie had mixed feelings about the event. Part of her appreciated the institutional recognition and apology, but another part couldn't help noting that it had taken 50 years and significant public pressure for the university to acknowledge any responsibility. Better late than never, she supposed, though the phrase felt hollow in this context. Her phone rang, interrupting her preparation. An unknown number, which she almost didn't answer until something made her reconsider. Dr. Chen speaking? Dr. Chen, my name is Michael Brennan. I'm Richard Brennan's grandson, Thomas Brennan's son. Sophie sat down abruptly. I didn't know Thomas had a son. Most people don't. My mother was pregnant when my father disappeared. She never told the Brennan family, wanted nothing to do with them after what happened. I only found out about my grandfather's involvement in my father's death a few years ago when my mother finally told me the truth. I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult to process. It was. It is. Michael paused. I'm calling because I read your book, and I wanted to thank you for how you portrayed my father. You made him a person, not just a victim. That meant a lot. They talked for nearly an hour, Michael sharing what little he knew about Thomas from his mother's stories, Sophie filling in details from her research. It was a strange conversation. Grandfather and grandson connected through tragedy, trying to understand a man neither had really known. Before hanging up, Michael asked a question that stopped Sophie cold. Do you think consciousness can survive death? Not scientifically, but do you personally believe it's possible? Sophie thought about Carolyn's testimony, Dorothy's experience, all the stories families had shared about sensing their children's presence on the night of the separation ceremony. She thought about 5 years of additional research into consciousness studies, none of which had produced any evidence for survival of awareness beyond physical death. Honestly, no, I don't think consciousness survives. I think it's an emergent property of brain function. And when the brain dies, consciousness ends. She paused. But I also think the human need to believe in something beyond is powerful, and maybe necessary. If believing your father's consciousness persists, somewhere gives you comfort, I'm not going to argue against that. Fair enough, Michael said. Thank you for your honesty. And thank you for the work you've done, keeping these stories alive. After ending the call, Sophie returned to her preparation, but her mind kept drifting back to the question of consciousness survival. She'd spent 5 years since the book's publication, becoming more firmly convinced that Thorne's theories were complete nonsense, that there was no evidence for any kind of existence beyond death. And yet sometimes, late at night in her office, surrounded by files and photographs of the 12 students, she would feel something. Not a presence exactly, but an awareness of absence. A space where lives should have continued, but had been cut short. It was probably just her imagination, her brain creating narrative meaning from nothing. But it felt real in those moments, felt like those 12 young people were somehow still there in spirit, if not in fact. She didn't believe in ghosts. She didn't believe in souls. She was a scientist, a researcher, trained to value evidence over intuition. But she also understood that some experiences transcended proof, existed in the space between knowing and hoping, between fact and meaning. The symposium took place on a crisp October afternoon, 50 years to the day after the field trip that had ended in tragedy. The university had erected a memorial on the quad, 12 trees planted in a circle, each with a plaque bearing a student's name and photograph. It was tasteful and permanent, a reminder that would outlast everyone currently alive who remembered the case. Sophie gave the keynote address, walking through the timeline of the disappearances, the investigation, the delayed justice. She spoke about institutional failures, ethical oversight, and the importance of questioning authority when something seems wrong. And she spoke about the 12 students themselves, their dreams, their personalities, their potential. Melissa Grayson wanted to study art in Paris, she told the assembled crowd. Thomas Brennan was planning to study engineering. Jennifer Oakes wanted to be a doctor. We don't just mourn the loss of 12 lives. We mourn the loss of all they might have become, all they might have contributed to the world if they'd been allowed to grow up. After the formal program, families and attendees gathered around the memorial trees. Sophie watched as Patricia Oakes, now 84 and in a wheelchair, was helped to Jennifer's tree. She placed her hand on the trunk and wept, and Sophie had to look away from the raw grief that 50 years hadn't diminished. Michael Brennan had traveled from California to attend, and Sophie introduced him to some of the other families. They stood together in front of Thomas's tree, sharing memories and stories, building connections across generations of trauma. As evening fell and the crowd dispersed, Sophie remained at the memorial, sitting on a bench facing the circle of trees. The campus had mostly emptied, students heading to dinner or their dorms, unaware of the significance of this particular day and place. She thought about how time moved forward, how the past became history, and history became story, and how eventually even the stories faded until only names on plaques remained. In another 50 years, who would remember the Millbrook 12? Her book would still exist, the memorial would still stand, but the emotional weight of the tragedy would fade as those who had known and loved the victims passed away. That was both sad and necessary, Sophie reflected. The world couldn't carry every tragedy forward with full intensity forever. People had to be allowed to forget, to move on, to build new lives that weren't entirely defined by loss. But for now, on this 50th anniversary, the memory was still alive, still sharp, and Sophie was grateful she'd played a part in preserving it, in ensuring these 12 young people were remembered not as statistics or case numbers, but as individuals whose lives had mattered. As she stood to leave, Sophie thought she felt something, a whisper of wind that seemed to circle through the trees, a moment of presence that might have been imagination or might have been something more. She didn't try to analyze it, didn't attempt to determine whether it was real or psychological projection. She simply acknowledged it, whispered, "I hope you found peace," and walked away. Behind her, the 12 trees stood in their circle, growing steadily year by year, their roots intertwining beneath the ground, their branches reaching toward a sky that would outlast memory and time, and all the human attempts to make meaning from tragedy. And whether consciousness survived or not, whether the 12 students existed somewhere beyond physical death, or had simply ended in story and memory and the hearts of those who mourned them, they persisted. That would have to be enough.